And every once in a while, from people tuning in, we might get comments,
Oh,
which is
cool.
always fun. It really just depends on when I schedule these and time of day and who's actually around.
Yeah.
It's always interesting to see who's actually up or watching.
Hmm.
Okay, look at that. We are streaming and I think we're good to go. So if you're ready, let's
I'm
make
ready
this
when
thing
you are.
happen. Okay. Just messed that up. Okay. Welcome to CinemaScope, where we ride into the heart of the diverse and captivating landscapes of cinema. I'm Andy Nelson, your trail guide on this journey through the dusty, morally ambiguous world of the post-war Western, where the American West is as vast and complex as the characters who inhabit it. In the wake of World War II, as the nation grappled with the scars of conflict and the uncertainty of a changing world, a new era of the Western emerged. Join us as we uncover the key characteristics that define this gritty and psychologically profound genre, from the haunted heroes and the blurred lines between good and evil to the stark cinematography and bittersweet endings. So saddle up and get ready to explore the frontier of the soul, because we're about to embark on a journey through the most iconic and transformative films of the post-war Western. Joining me today, I am thrilled to have Assistant Professor of Film and Media Studies, John Sanders, joining me to discuss these post-war Westerns. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I am thrilled to have you, especially because, as you know, through all of our conversations before this, it's become quite clear that you are a passionate lover of Westerns. And without sounding too punny, I want to start off by saying, what spurred on your love for the Western?
Oh, I'm sure there's going to be plenty of puns
Yeah,
coming
right.
on. We'll have to wrangle them all together at the end.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. So, I'm a little bit weird to a weird guest to have on a cinephilic podcast like this. I think mainly because I wasn't really a cinephile, or at least I didn't really start that way. So a lot of people who come into film studies from English or from the humanities, where I do, start by doing English stuff, so your general literature, and then falling in love or like really loving film on the side, and then moving that into what they're doing, right?
Gotcha.
Myself, I came loving literature and actually wanted to study video games and digital and new media sort of works. And in doing that, I went and became a lover of film later on. So growing up, I didn't really have a lot of background on the Western, or at least the things I knew of the Western, because I was growing up as a millennial in a kind of a dearth of the Western, right? Throughout
Sure,
the
yeah.
80s, there was a lot of a low point for the Westerns. In the 90s, we had some of these revisionist Westerns. This is where we actually started getting Academy Awards for things like Unforgiven or Dances with Wolves. But, I was a little young at the time for those, and I was watching other things. My dad would always quote Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which we'll be talking about later, which is arguably a Western, and I'm
Sure,
sure people
sure.
will have
Yeah.
questions about that later. But really what got me into Westerns was I was on the job market, and I was trying to put together a good um, uh, a good syllabus for people to see what I'm all about. And
Yeah.
I'd started watching a couple Westerns throughout my graduate school, and then I just got into watching this Westerns as a way of doing an introduction to film and doing a film per decade for an entire introduction to film class. And I decided on the Western because the more I watched them, the more I became fascinated with this idea of the Westerns being kind of the film history thing. So
Yeah.
you can't really understand the history of American filmmaking without understanding the Western and understanding the development of the Western. We have things early on. We'll talk about the history, I'm sure, in a minute, so I won't
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
too much there. But really, this got into from just looking at this as someone who was interested in film, yes, and has fallen in love with that. Also interested in myths, these ideas of knights and castles were what I was always growing up with, and like questing knights and grails, and very interested in what makes an American, right? And so being part of American history and thinking about American mythology really pulled me over to what the films do. So as opposed to a lot of folks that I have been able to bond with, especially older folks, older academics who are interested in like, oh, did you see this Western? There's a colleague here who's always like, have you seen this? And I'm always saying, well, yes, it's on my list, as many things are. But as opposed to people who have this nostalgia for certain periods of the Westerns, whether that was your Clint Eastwood Westerns or your John Wayne Westerns, or if you're really an old timer like the Gene Autry, Roy Rogers sort of Westerns, I was always growing up with looking at them as an outsider and coming in and a visitor to this place, that has really become a something that resonates with some deep American parts of my soul, and deep parts of mythology too. So my love for the Western really came from a roundabout trail, I suppose.
Holy cow, yeah. A long and winding trail, indeed.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. It's a good glimpse into how you kind of latched onto it, and the fact that it's not just like, I mean, you're talking about all these different people and all these different generations who like this type of Western or that type of Western, but it sounds like through all these conversations, you've kind of grown to appreciate kind of a wide swath of kind of all of them.
Yeah, but that said, and the reason why I was so excited when you pitched this Western idea to me is that I really want to talk about the post-war Westerns and something of the 50s, the golden age of the Western, which is something that a lot of my students coming into things, when they know Westerns, they think, oh, Quentin Tarantino did one or two, right? And people who know a little bit more from their parents are like, oh, yeah, Clint Eastwood's the best. That's what a classic Western is. Yeah. I'm like, well, there's earlier classics, right? Yeah, and we don't really go back there. And so by engaging with the 50s, I found the sort of myth making and allegorical areas of this, and also a little bit of the darkness, but still not losing to the kind of European style cynicism that we get from like Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is very much a very Italian movie, and people don't really realize that at the time. I found a real love for things during this golden age. So having to find things right in the 50s and right in the post-war era was a really fun assignment.
It's a sweet spot. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's set the stage for where Westerns were before all of this. Before the post-war, there was the pre-war. And the Westerns in the 20s and 30s, it was a very, very popular genre. It kind of painted this romanticized picture of the American frontier, you know, and people weren't that far from that era, right? Like when Cimarron came out and won an Oscar in the early 30s, it was only like, you know, 40 or 50 years from the period that they were talking about. And so it's like looking back to our own childhoods for many of us, you know?
Exactly.
And I think that's what's so interesting. And so, yeah, you definitely had like these clear-cut heroes and villains, and the lone cowboy, the damsel in distress, the villain, the climactic showdown. There was a lot of that sort of stuff that, I don't know, was it the just kind of, I mean, again, this mythic landscape painting the American frontier, but I think some of it was probably just escapism and just adventure stories that they were telling. The Great Depression was going on, you know, getting out of World War I. There was kind of this period of just wanting something to kind of reflect on our own past in a very kind of shiny way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Jim Kitz's in his book or his compilation, The Western Studies Readers, which he wrote in the late 90s, early 2000s, starts with this great line that all academics want to make for a while. That's many people have tried to bury the Western, right? It's a great way to start with that because as you kind of pointed out, there were a lot of different eras, but the Westerns have always been sort of backwards working and obsolete at the same time, right? Like, so to go even back further, I guess, the pre-cinematic Westerns, things like Pulp Fiction stories, there's a lot of tales of captivity narratives that go back into the 1700s. We'll talk more about that when we talk about the Searchers, but also landscape painting. The Hudson River School was really big. So painting these ideas of, as the West is opening up, like, what is America? It's these huge outside things. We get paintings of the American West and Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows in 1883, before film really begins, are some of these things that send it not just through the U.S., but throughout the world, right? Buffalo Bill went to Europe. There's pictures of him in a postcard and his folks in Venice. He went to the Queen's Gala at this one point and did all these things. So there was already a kind of institution before we get in the 1890s some more actualities and melodramas. So one of the first images I show my students is something that's been called the Sioux Ghost Dance, but is more likely Lakota Grass Dance, which is a filming in the Edison studio of Native American actors, people from usually the Oglala Band Sioux, who are doing a dance that is part of what they would do in Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. Then there was also a bunch of things like pictures from people doing trick shooting to jumping on steers. These sort of things are actualities. So people were wanting to see this and this idea of the American West. And it isn't until really the Great Train Robbery, which people call the first Western, which actually at the time was just seen as a crime melodrama because it was based on things that were happening like 3 years ago. And it was about trains was the main thing, like come see this. As a matter of fact, it's filmed in the Wild West of Essex County, New Jersey. So it's very, very different at these points, but it's not really until we get into the 1908 and we get the Invaders from 1912, or later on where we get the silent era epics of Westerns, people where we start getting more of the tied to the track sort of things come a little bit later as well. But we get The Iron Horse is John Ford's first Western in 1924. I mentioned The Invaders, which is 1912. Francis Ford before that, and then we start getting into the 20s and 30s with the sound film. We get more not only stronger acted or more dialogue heavy movies, but we get singing cowboy westerns, right? Gene Autry is coming out in the 1930s and these sort of things. This would continue on through the 50s, but really by the 1920s, we have already parodies of Westerns. Buster Keaton's Go West is making fun of a lot of things that we've seen in other Westerns. It's kind of at a lull or seen as this B-movie thing. And we would see Westerns this way for a while. Westerns are cheap to make, right? You can get a couple of extras. You can get a horse or two and some guns. You just go out into this desert somewhere and shoot something. And that was something that was there for most of their history, right? It isn't until the late 1930s, right before the war starts, that we get a couple of films that really kick off the golden age of the Western. Some of these include Stagecoach, John Ford's 1939, which really pushes John Wayne to stardom as one of my favorite films. Union Pacific, Cecil B. DeMille with Barbara Stanwyck as one of the main characters here. We'll see her again in 40 Guns. And Destry Rides Again in 1939 with James Stewart, George Marshall. And then the Westerner, I think you could count as this too, William Wyler's 1940s with Gary Cooper. But it's right before the war we start getting films that can show us, these are not just B movies we can do over and over and over again. These are back to the epics that they were at the end of the silent period, right? We can get something that is doing something grander. And so this sets the stage. There's a little bit of a lull during the war years. There are certainly Westerns coming out, but especially when John Wayne is doing war films and some like melodramas, and we get competition with film noir. There isn't much of that until after the war. And then we're really jumping into this, going back into the A Westerns and the big Westerns in earnest. At the same time that B Westerns and stuff are always coming out. There was about 140 Westerns per year at its peak during this period, which is insane, thinking that we only are producing like 140 Westerns from the last 2 decades or something, like these sort of things. So it was a really big time. It was the Marvel universe of its day, as a lot of people are saying.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective, like painting that picture to really get a sense as to just how popular they were. And I think that's what some people today just kind of have forgotten about, or never really even knew, the fact that it was like the thing that everyone was really into. It felt very American, right? It just felt like authentic, a part of our history, and these adventures of real Americans going out and taming the West. And I think that there was something about that I think people definitely enjoyed. we're hitting this point though. You talked about kind of that shift to World War II and everybody coming back, and now we have like the aftermath, and there's societal dynamics that are shifting. That I think I suppose kind of the first part, as people are recognizing everything that has just gone on with the war, and we see soldiers coming back, and the shift in how the women were working to kind of support, and the doing their part and all of that sort of stuff. On top of that, I think it's just important to remember, like in a few other things in the world of film, we're kind of the Hays Code is still around. It's still operating. So we still are. There's still kind of we have these adult themes, the moral ambiguity, is violence and everything. The Hays Code, I think, is it doesn't end until like the 60s, but it's waning. I think it's fair to say that it's not as strong as it was in the in the last decade, the late 30s, early 40s. We also have film noir that's kind of developing alongside this, which certainly, I mean, it's been from the 30s all through the 40s into the 50s, but I think that that tone of that moral ambiguity and the psychology, the depth of kind of the psychological stories, I think we're seeing as we kind of progress into these stories. And likewise, I think a lot of these will start talking about like the way that they're shooting it, because I think that ties into noir too. Lots of stark lighting, deep shadows. HUAC is going on, the Red Scare, the start of the Cold War and everything, and which starts reflecting kind of the paranoia of the era and everything, and the uncertainty, and that ties into a lot of the morality. And we'll certainly discuss some of kind of the HUAC tones and everything as we look at some of these films. Another element is TV. Like this is the rise of TV that we have, and they're trying to come up with stuff that can play in the theaters that might not play on TV. So we're getting a little more of the more complex themes, a little more adult oriented and stuff. And also I thought this was interesting as I was reading. I wasn't thinking about this, but method acting really kind of was getting started, and kind of there's that influenced kind of these actors wanting to get a little more psychological in the realism, their emotional intensity as they were performing. And so I think as we see all of this, you start seeing, it starts making sense how this is definitely an era for kind of this shift to these more moral gray areas that we're seeing in these stories. And really kind of we're seeing there's this toll on frontier life, this psychological toll that people have that we're kind of looking at in these films. And I think all of that is really challenging this image that they had of the American West, and who we were, and how we treated people and everything. And I think it gives a much more nuanced perspective to everything that had come before. And I think that's what I find so interesting about this particular genre, is how it really is taking so many of those elements, and it's shifting, and it's pushing these tones forward.
I'll yes and what you're saying. 1948 is the Paramount case, right? That is going to be the death knell for the studio system as we know it. But the gorillas are so big, they're not going to fall over for another 12 years, right? Same with the code, the Hays Code you said before. It's certainly not as repressive as it was before the war for multiple different reasons. But there are more people who are starting to push against it for whatever reasons there are. And you see that by the end of the 50s. And certainly by the 60s, people are not caring about it anymore at all. So there is that development as things go. And one of the reasons I wanted to do when we were discussing which Western period we want to do, thinking about this, is that you could do multiple episodes on all the different Westerns that come before this. The reason I like the 50s is because it is a period of revisionism, though we usually hear the term revisionism either in the 60s or the 70s, which are kind of like the anti-Westerns, iconoclastic Westerns, some of which I love, like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, or the 90s, which is like, hey, now the Cold War's over, let's go back and think what was going on with race and those sort of things. And there were some stumbles there too. But you see in the 50s, a lot of these ideologies bubbling up and dealing with not only this, but civil rights, thinking about racial issues as well, and kind of having this that are beginning to boil over into a point where you'll see some of these films are just wild in the way that they're just trying to grapple with something, and they don't always do it well, but that's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Especially with the Blacklist stuff, but we'll talk about that as well. So yeah, I think that this period in particular, because of all the industrial and the social changes that we've talked about, not even to speak about all the technological and stylistic changes that we're getting with like CinemaScope and trying to get people into the theaters again, whereas a lot of Westerns, I guess I'll step back. A lot of things I have to explain to my students is, yes, a lot of genre films seem similar because you would go to the movies and see John Wayne in a movie, and then that movie would be gone. There'd be no DVDs. You would not own a projector. There's no television. So you'd go again a little while later to see another John Wayne movie that's kind of like the one before, except a little different. So when you get all these films, especially these cycles, we'll talk about the Renown cycle and things like that, where it seems like we kind of just saw this movie. It's because, you've remade it with different people in a slightly different register. It's not like the Netflix era now where it's like, why would we ever watch a movie that's exactly the same? Because we could just watch that other movie, right? There was no competition there. And then when you get television, you're starting to get more reruns of these old movies that they're pulling back. And the idea of having something that you come to every week that you need a lot of content for, allowed Westerns, which were, again, cheaper to make, start making their own television shows too. So when you get these, you have this fascination with what America is, what America is doing, looking at our past, right, after this big battle that we've had against fascism at the time, that now are starting to become questioned even there, that are creating a very fecund space for this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. We're seeing this sense of this place where there's just so many elements that are hitting all at the same time. You've got the TV, and so we want these bigger images, and CinemaScope is glorious for so many of these fantastic Westerns. I mean, John Wayne in Monument Valley, as seen by John Ford, is just it's stunning, right? You're seeing some just amazing images, but then also you've got like all of these societal issues, like the HUAC hearings, and then you've got the Hays Code, and you've got people coming back from the war. All of these things just hit right at this moment. It honestly, it makes the 50s in so many film genres like incredibly rich. This massive world war that affected people all around. I mean, having discussed the French New Wave and just recently the British New Wave, right before this, like all things that have kind of been affected and influenced by people coming back from the war and everything. And so I find that to be just absolutely fascinating. One thing I like to talk about on this show is where it fits in what I call the cinematic family tree. And, so we have kind of like the traditional Western branch of things. And this is kind of an evolution of that, kind of an offshoot of that. It's building upon these established conventions that we've already talked about. And then it's subverting all of these tropes and everything. And I think that this is one, I think, we already kind of brought up some sense of film noir, how it was kind of developing next to this. But just thinking about other genres that I think also are kind of tapping into this. And I was like, film noir, obviously war films, because this is an era for even a shift of war films and how the tone of war films made during the war versus after the war.
Oh yeah.
There's a real a change in how those feel. And then we're also starting to see more films dealing with social problems. And so those three areas, I was like, that's kind of an interesting amalgam of different genres that all are kind of tapping into how people are looking at things after the war.
Yeah. No, and even during the war too, right? I think the genres you mentioned, if I'm going to like reframe them my own way, crime, Westerns and crime genre have been very connected since the Great Train Robbery and before. Like, who is the outlaw? Who's the lawman? It's not always clear, especially by the time you get to these larger Westerns. But you got that earlier, too. You got this vigilante justice sort of thing going on.
Yeah.
Stagecoach, 1939, like, Ringo Starr is wanted because he's going to kill these guys who killed his brother, right? Which is, so it's already a question of, like, who the outlaw is there. But crime films, not so much the detective films, but what we would call film noir, they'd probably see as hard-boiled detective films. It wasn't really until the French kind of binge watched it afterwards and said, there's something here, that became a genre or a mode or a style. I'm sure in the comments and everyone listening to this will have their own opinion. It's not a genre. There's people who do that. But the idea of this individual masculine force trying to fight where the law is unable to do their thing is something that comes up with this as well. And not to mention melodrama, right? Altman, Robert Altman, Rick Altman, Robert Altman's the different guy. Talks about genre as growing from adjectives to nouns, right? So before it was the Western, it was the Western romance or the Western musical. It was the adjective to whatever thing it was. Especially when it came to romance and melodrama, that's kind of melded into what the Western was at this time. Right. So you'll still see elements of romance here, as well as elements of crime and lawman here, looking at this family tree sort of aspect. And I think, and we'll see this as things go through into the 50s, the Western itself begins to get questions of okay, what is a B Western? What is a super Western? What is the kind of revisionist Western that we'll talk about later, that begin to have those family trees. But there was definitely this feeling of in the post-war years, the happy-go-lucky thing, fine for some folks. That's why B Westerns are still around. But Gene Autry is not going to be the guy that is the face of the Western from that point on. He will be on television, him and Roy Rogers, right?
Very different tone there,
very different tone. And what we want on the screen was some heroes that, again, more method acting, have a little bit more grit to them, I suppose. Which is where we get to where we are. But I hope that kind of answers the question. But I was yes-anding that again. It's connected with these genres.
No, absolutely. And, you also mentioned some of those other things. And I think that's important to mention that even within the post-war Western, we're seeing, I guess we'll call them kind of some loose subgenres there as well, right? Like we have kind of what we're discussing as kind of a psychological Western, which I think a lot of people call this post-war Western and psychological Westerns.
Absolutely.
Also adult Westerns, I hear, which, is just... It kind of is psychological, but maybe it's not necessarily as psychological. It just might have some more, tackling just more mature themes. And then feminist Westerns, we're starting to see that in here. And then anti-Westerns, we see some of those types of stories as well. So I'm trying to think if we are talking about any specific anti-Westerns, but I'm thinking of things like Oxbow Incident or Bad Day at Black Rock as some potentials in that world.
Those could be, I think, anti-Western is such an interesting term. It's usually, for me, I usually apply that to the things in the 60s, things like The Wild Bunch or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, in which they are definitely taking the Western myth and trying to explode it in a way that is still very violent, which is interesting, right? Versus something like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is very much... trying to deflate it to the nth degree by changing a lot of these sort of things. Oxbow Incident feels much more a noir Western sort of thing, but that's also because it's right around there in the early 40s.
Early
40s. We've gone. That one is one that's in the back of my craw, and I still haven't gotten to figure out a way to talk about it yet. But that's a fascinating one too. There's definitely. What we would consider anti-Western now, being in the 21st century, probably was something that folks back then would consider. They'd probably be more, this is not the Western we like. High Noon got that criticism. That's why we have Rio Bravo. We'll talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Before we start talking about the movies, I want to just kind of, we've talked about so many different elements of them so far, but I just want to kind of walk through what we're looking at as kind of like some of the core components of what we see in post-war Westerns. Morally ambiguous protagonists. Let's start with that one. These people who are haunted by their past or inner demons that they're dealing with. And we're starting to see them blurring the line in these films between a hero and an anti-hero, which really... We're no longer black hat, white hat, right? We're recognizing there's this complexity in human nature. And we see that really develop over the course of this And actually, it's interesting just just talking about this point, looking at John Wayne's evolution here from Red River to the Searchers, because Red River, yeah, he still is kind of a hero. He's kind of way too gruff and authoritarian, but there still is this familial connection between him and Montgomery Clift. And then we get to the Searchers, where it's like, oh, okay, now I'm definitely seeing a very different version of this sort of cowboy. And that's an interesting kind of journey just for one particular actor to take over this.
Absolutely. When we push that back to, again, Stagecoach or 1949's My Darling Clementine, like, this is a very different trajectory as we've gotten. And it just gets more and more gritty from there. True Grit aside, right, as things come in. But yeah, so we do have psychologically questioning protagonists in this way, and more in that regard. I think if we're looking at the Western in general, I know you have more, so I don't want to cut us off too much.
Please.
One of my students in my class, I asked, what is the Western at the very beginning of class? And they helpfully said, guys shooting guns on horses. And that does fit, but like, those are some of the three major components that were even before this, where it's guys, it's talking about masculinity, what makes a good man, how does masculinity work, and kind of questioning that. And of course, whenever you're talking about masculinity, you're talking about femininity in that way. And then shooting guns, it's talking about the role of violence in society, how violence connects to masculinity, how violence connects to the American way, right? What does American masculinity and all these things mean? And of course, riding horses is freedom, the idea of these open spaces and these questioning these things in the frontier, which we're getting questioning all of these things. So I'd say, yes, it's questioning the moral protagonists, but also questioning the violence, why we shoot guns, not just the guys on the horses, but why we shoot guns and where we're actually going with those horses, that land itself. I think all of those are being seen in a shadowy register. But yeah, in short, certainly psychological protagonists.
I know, and that's a great point, just kind of like expanding that beyond just the protagonist, because I think it applies to so many of these points. The next one I had was a grittier, more realistic style, stark cinematography, psychological depth. We're seeing, already I talked about kind of the connection to film noir, harsh lighting, deep shadows, rugged landscapes, conveying a sense of unease and moral uncertainty. I mean, we see rugged landscapes in a lot of Westerns. It's certainly not just this. But I think it's interesting to see some of the specifics as to how they use the landscape in some of these that I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think there's more sparse landscapes too.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes you're watching them and like, why are they settling here? This doesn't seem like a place that is actually good for settling to do any of the stuff that they're trying to do, but it ties into the story well, I guess. Yeah. And so I think that's another element in just how they're shooting it, whether it's black and white, because this is definitely the period of we're seeing a lot of black and white films, a lot of color films. We have an amalgam between the two throughout. I think, I guess I didn't count. I'm thinking we probably had more black and white than color in our.
I think we have more black and white in this list than color. Ride Lonesome's color, Big Country's color, I think. 40 Guns.
40 Guns
is black and white.
Yes, black and white.
The Searchers, definitely color. Johnny Guitar, color. Shane, color. So yeah, we have just about 5.
So almost halfway. It was about halfway. Yeah. Okay. But still, I think even in the color films, there still is some of that sense of this. Like even in the Big Country, with like these vast landscape shots that we have throughout the film.
Yeah.
I mean, the landscape swallows the people up often, the way that William Wyler shot it, and I found that to be absolutely fascinating. Where it's almost more about like this, like you're a tiny little speck in this space, And so,
during that fight scene, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that's a really good thing. And the colors also in some of these, like Big Country and Ride Lonesome, are much paler overall. So it's not like there seems to be a hue that's different than, say, Johnny Guitar, which is very Technicolor, right? It's very bright in a really interesting way. But yeah, versus some of the color B Westerns, which are very much more dramatic in their own way. I'm thinking of like Annie Get Your Gun or something like that. Or maybe I'm thinking of a different musical of Annie Oakley. There's a couple that are in there. So maybe that one's not in color. But there were a lot of more colorful ways of approaching it too.
Yeah, definitely.
Mhm.
Another element, we have themes of individuality, redemption, and the changing American West. Exploring this tension between personal freedoms and societal obligations. Like that's kind of this. I mean, it's an interesting perpetual shift in a lot of Western stories as settlers are settling, but it's still kind of wild, and it's that balance between finding a way to kind of move toward more of a society and less of a just kind of like the shoot 'em ups sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we're seeing quite a bit as through these, where it's it's a metaphorical story where you're seeing like the how the nation is shifting.
Yeah.
Right. And in a lot of these.
Absolutely. I think do you have more on that one? Because I can jump on this one certainly.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
One of the things that I found about the Western when it comes to this question of the individual versus morality, there's a couple of breakdowns that people have done. I've mentioned Kitz's before, between civilization and wilderness, with the East and the West, the individual, the collective and the individual, the feminine and the masculine. There's ways of reading it that way. For me, the Western has always shown the idealism and ugliness of American ideology. Right.
Yeah.
In the Western, we see tenacity. We see individual folks getting themselves up by their bootstraps. We see small groups of people in a large natural environment trying to make their way and pushing against larger corporate interests, trying to exploit the land or pushing these things, and people who know what is right and stand up for what is right, even if it costs them something. And this resourcefulness that really has described the American character in its own way. Not to mention the American landscape itself, all the things we are showing, like this is the beauty of our landscape. Let's not forget it. But on the other hand, we have sexism, racism, genocide, the idea, the insidious idea that a good guy with a gun is the only one who can stop a bad guy with a gun.
Yeah, right.
And not to mention the whole myth of the frontier myth itself, right? Jackson Turner, at the end of the census, like in the late 1800s, wrote this idea of American identity being very much about frontiersmanship. It was taking the germ of Europe and going into the frontier, and then from that it becomes something else. And for me, I think that's American is very optimistic. There's always another land further west. You can always go west. Like, hey, you didn't make it here, you can make it there, right? You can keep going. Even when the frontiers are closed, there's this idea. But that is predicated on the myth that this land was unoccupied. This land has never been unoccupied.
No, right,
the
right.
land where my university stands right now is the ancestral lands of the Catawba and other groups who have been here forever. So the thing about the Western has always been having these contradictions. But in the 50s, we're beginning to deal with that a little bit more than we've seen in the past. We're beginning to see the what it means to be an American doesn't mean you can just say, yeah, forget about that part. We kind of have to deal with the complications that come from the violence of the frontier, the strength of masculinity, and the question of whose space is this and how do we treat it. It's something that's been around the whole time, but I think in the 50s we really begin to see these getting questioned in an interesting way, especially when we're up against the communists, who are in many ways against a lot of things Americans stand for, according to the ideas at the time. Right, this is what HUAC's all about too. And people who are more sympathetic have other ideas of what collectivity versus individuality means. So we get a lot of that in here, even if and this is why I tell my students, whether you are very liberal or conservative, you're going to find a lot of both of those in these ideologies of the Westerns, because the US itself is made up of a lot of these contradictions. And we have to figure out, how do we deal with that and what stories are we telling? So, again, that was a little bit of a tangent, but I think that like this idea of ideology and what stories and myths we're telling is really important to what is going on here in the 50s and the post-war era.
Yeah, and stories and mythologies, I can't remember how you worded it, but it's something about like how this genre is like something that's always looking backward, right? Like it takes place in the past. We're thinking about our our histories and everything. And that's the shift that we're seeing here. It's no longer just fun tales of life in the West. It's like now we're actually looking back and like looking at those past misdeeds and grappling with what that means to us. And we're really thinking about these things now and how we fit into that picture and you know, and its reflection. And I think that's another important element. And, you know, I think that's part of it is, you know, this collision of the mythology with modern reality. And what I find so interesting in all of these stories is the way that they start thinking about the stories through modern eyes. And I think that's another component that we see a lot of them is addressing it through the lens of the genre.
Yeah, no, I think that with the backwards looking thing, it was the gunslinger character, which we'll talk about more, is always someone who cannot survive for the progress, right? Like there are no room for guns in the valley to pull from Shane. We know that our days are numbered. The Western films are coming out at the end of the West, right? This is the frontier has closed. There's still some train robberies going on. There's still some things there, but civilization has moved in, right? So this is already looking back and saying, hey, this is the way we're looking at things. But I think there's more of a desire to look back at this moment and at this time, this post-World War II era, and think about, oh, what is all the violence we have wrought? Even if it wouldn't be the kind of revisionism we would expect in the 90s or now, certainly, it was a way of looking back while we're kind of looking forward. And it's a way that didn't really have that bitterness of lack of optimism that comes from the American character of, yeah, I'm big. There's room for everybody. Let's just keep going. Like, bring in your tired, you're poor, right? Which is, one of the contradictions of America itself that we're dealing with. But it is a matter of a moment to look back and think about what is going on now. As Kitsa says, many people have tried to bury the Western, right? And it's still going, and it's on way.
I have one other kind of core component that I'd written down: character-driven narratives and social commentaries, where our characters are much more complex. They have more complex character arcs. Their relationships are much more complex, and the way that we're using the Western setting to explore some of these the personal challenges, the societal themes, and we're starting to see kind of more pessimistic, bittersweet types of endings. It's not always just everyone's happy and riding off into the sunset. And I think those are some key elements that we're seeing with kind of these character-driven narratives.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think some narratives on our list are less character-driven than others because of the mythical element of it, right? Yeah. Like, we'll talk about Shane, but Shane is kind of Joe Starrett's imaginary friend who just comes from the wilderness and is the spirit of the West, and trying to read him as a realistic character. There are certainly ways of reading it that way. I think it doesn't necessarily lend itself to the same sort of thing as reading, say, Van Heflin's character in 3:10 to Yuma as an individual character, these sort of ways. And we see this with Winchester 73 as well. It's very much pulpy narrative as these things go. But you're right, compared to a lot of the B-Westerns of, hey, you saw John Wayne before, we're going to show you John Wayne again. It's just the John Wayne show over and over, which is not the case for all of his filmography. I'm not going to say that, but thinking of things in the B-Western idea of, you saw this guy, this could very well be the next installment of his story, is a little more realistic, a little more character driven than that in these. Seeing that transition that we'll get, and the uneven relationship to Western as myth and Western as an excuse to tell a different story, or as sometimes I was thinking when I was putting my syllabus together, Westerns that aren't just Westerns, for people who are like, hey, if you don't like Westerns, maybe you'll still like this because this. That's also what they were thinking at the film too. It's like, why is it black and white? Let's be a little bit more artistic here, right? In these sort of degrees. So there is a matter of that too.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point because, you know, as we kind of move out of this, we start seeing films like Lonely Are the Brave, which ostensibly is a Western. It's about a cowboy, but it's in
Yeah,
modern times. Like it's pretty much set present day ish,
absolutely.
and but it still is very much kind of a Western. So there is that shift. Um, those are kind of what I had written down. Do you have any others as far as what we'd call kind of core components of post-war Westerns?
Yeah, I should have waited here to explain what I was saying before, but yeah, no, I mean, as I said, the masculinity, thinking about what masculinity is, in its own senses, the role of violence in society, and what it means to be part of a frontier, I think
Yeah,
are the only things there. As we kind of mentioned before, the Western for me is what happens when the idealism of the law, the rubber hits the road, right? It's like,
sure.
okay, we think this is what everyone should do. In practicality, it doesn't always work like that. So in a Jeffersonian democracy framework that's like pro yeoman farmer and bad big government, it's like, this is the idea that civilization says you ought to do. This is how it actually works in practice, right?
Hmm.
And we'll see that again through any genre, any part of the genre of the Western. But it's
Yeah.
really where the frontier allows for this space that is not quite lawlessness and not quite civilization, but there's forces on either end of law and chaos trying to figure out a way to deal with each other and live with each other in a way that I think we will get throughout all of these. So the contradictions we will see about masculinity, about violence, about who owns what and what should be belong to whom are something that comes in through all of these, because it is the matter of the American practicality meets the American idealism, right? What happens when you, an American optimist, go out into the world and realize, oh man, there's a lot more out there, and we have to deal with that together. And it does so in a way that is, I don't want to say distinctly American, because there's so much things of what makes things American, but in a way that I don't want to be a centralist, but I know that somebody wrote about the about film noir as a group, that film noir, it could only be made by the kind of stories of film noir could only be made by a very optimistic society, because this is what your idea of what pessimism is, which is interesting in its sense,
Yeah.
versus the sort of things we'll see post-war and post-war Europe, where we have bombed out buildings of Italy and France and things, and like what ennui means, right? It feels like a very different sort of thing that is being approached in because America didn't have their shores invaded, with the exception of Hawaii and Alaska, different places that were that other troops were on American soil. And I'm sure there's people who have other examples that I'm missing. It was not facing the same sort of destruction that we would have got elsewhere. And I think that allowed the optimism to be intact. So even when bitterness comes into these, the bitterness is still tinged in an American optimistic way.
It's an interesting way to look at it, because I think you can still, there's still plenty of pessimism throughout these films, but
absolutely.
but that's an interesting view. And you know, just following up on your point about the lawlessness and trying to find society, like, it's multiple films on our list that we're going to be discussing where they say, like, there's a point in the film where they say the closest sheriff is like 200 miles away, so we got to figure this out here. Like, that happens over and over again. Like, it's all about society figuring out how to be a society. That's
yeah, and these little
constellated
societies try to connect to the other societies in its own way. It's like the Washington is watching somehow, even though it's slightly far away. It's convenient when they are, and then inconveniently they aren't.
Right. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to start digging into the films. All right, we are back, and now it's time to start discussing our films. For this conversation, John and I are going to discuss 12 post-war Westerns: The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, Red River, The Gunfighter, Winchester 73, High Noon, Shane, Johnny Guitar, The Searchers, 310 to Yuma, 40 Guns, The Big Country, and Ride Lonesome. That is quite a list.
Yes.
We're going to cover 6 of these in the main conversation, and the remaining 6 will be exclusively available for our members. If you would like to access the full discussion enjoy other great perks, consider becoming a member at truestory.fm/learn. That's truestory.fm/learn. For just $5 a month or $55 a year, you get access to ad-free episodes and bonus content across all 5 podcasts in the Next Reels family: The Next Reel, The Film Board, Movies We Like, Sitting in the Dark, and, of course, CinemaScope. Now let's saddle up and ride into the heart of the post-war Western. First up, now John, before we jump into post-war Westerns proper, you wanted to set the stage with a film that you see as this crucial bridge between the moral shadows of film noir to the psychological landscapes of this post-war Western. And that film is The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, directed by John Huston in 1948. This is a tale of greed, mistrust, and moral decay that seems to anticipate the existential crises and corrupted ideals that we're going to see haunting the Westerns to come. But how exactly does this story of 3 prospectors searching for gold in the Mexican wilderness lay this groundwork for the post-war transformation?
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to put this one on. I know we've pushed the edges of these. It's a very good movie. People really like this movie overall. Was considered has been considered by many different metrics a very good film, and I like the way that it's shot and the whole plot of it itself. When I have this onto my Westerns course, it is because, one, I wanted something for the 40s, but I also wanted something for the 40s that showed how I approach genre and how I approach this genre specifically, because it doesn't really feel like a Western. If you see Western, you're thinking guys on shooting guns on horses. Technically, those are here, right? There is a place where, as they are, the 3 main characters are going in a train. There is a train robbery. There are outlaws. It is on a frontier. This is technically Mexico, and also literally Mexico. Shot in Tampico, with a little bit of a snafu there, where they actually had to get somebody to work on their behalf because they didn't bribe the newspaper person and were only pushed out. But there is a lot of the stuff that makes things a Western, but people don't feel like it's a Western because it is so dark, right? This is about Humphrey Bogart, who very excitedly says, "I'm playing the worst guy you've ever seen. You've got to see this picture," to his friends. And he is, for me, he's very different in this sort of world, but he fits into the world of film noir. Humphrey Bogart, because he's also John Huston is known for Maltese Falcon from 1941, which people have put either proto-noir or very close to noir. And before that, Bogart was known as this heavy in a lot of these B gangster movies. So he becomes this kind of crook character who has like this kind of dirty fedora and wants to, uses money that he constantly begs for. Can you spare a fellow American to a meal? Who actually happens to be John Huston himself, saying like, "Give me this," and it's like, "I won't give you another dime after this." He uses that for his own pleasure, for getting haircuts, for doing going to a house of ill repute. It's implied different things that he will do for his own pleasure, and then when he gets lucky enough to win the lottery, he says, "Hey, let's go and get this money." Who he's saying this to is Bob Curtin, who's played by Tim Holt. Tim Holt, known from B and singing Westerns before this, being more of your white hat sort of guy. He's been in other movies as well, but he'd probably be more recognized as this Westerner. So what you get is essentially what Robert Warshaw wrote: the gangster and the Westerner is 2 different approaches to men with guns in American cinema. One who's very much from this noir and gangster pictures before it, and one from the Western, which has been throughout all of these, but we're moving here. Between them is Walter Huston, who is playing this old and very lively prospector, who's kind of like, "I'm not sure which way you're going to go." But you get this idea of both of them. There's this really interesting scene where both of them are asked, "What are you going to do with the money when you get it?" And Curtin essentially says, "I once worked as a fruit picker, and I wanted to go back there and just." We had our times. We sang in the evenings. We worked all day. We hung out with each other. It was beautiful. It's Edenic the way he describes it, right? And he says, "I would like to get money to maybe get my own to become a fruit seller again. And then Dobbs comes in and says, I'm going to buy everything on the menu. I'm going to go in the biggest restaurant. I'm going to send everything back, even if it is good. I'm going to get these things. And then they're both asked by Walter, so then what? And he says, what else is there? And that, for me, is him encapsulating the idea of the gangster, which is ambition and the American dream turned on its head, the American nightmare. You start from the bottom. Usually gangsters were folks from either the gutter or the immigrant class or both. You go to the very top. And then because you go to the very top in the wrong way, you are legally, and by the Hays Code, pretty much legally, obligated to get killed so that you cannot say that happened. Versus the Westerner is not after money for money's sake. They're a man of leisure, as Warshar calls them. They're virtuous in their own way, but the way they want, the thing that their final goal is to, like, the most American thing you can think of is like, I want to have a business where I work for the rest of my days, but I take my time in the evening singing, right? And while he's saying that, you get this like beautiful kind of like Mexican guitar solo. So it sounds like it's somewhere further west or somewhere further south, that you're just getting this idea. And throughout this whole film, as they're becoming more cynical and cautious of each other, we see Curtin becoming more of the, I'm only going to react when you have to react. I have to use violence against you. I'm going to save you when the mine collapses, sort of thing. And we see Dobbs being more and more paranoid in the film noirish way, which is saying, who is he going to steal my stuff? Are you going to steal my stuff? And they meet the ends that happen to these characters in the stock photographs, in the stock genres. Sorry. Dobbs gets beheaded with all the gold he has, and the outlaw Alfonso Bedoya's Gold Hat just thinks all of the gold is dust and sends it to the wind, leaving when Curtin comes back with Howard to pretty much get justice for this. He realizes not only has Dobbs been dead, but all the stuff they worked for is gone. And they have this moment where they just laugh to the wind. And he says, where are you going to go? And he says, I'm going to go orchard pick. He's going to go back to where he was. He's going to go back to the orchard. He's going to go back to Eden, somewhere further west, moving on to the next town, which is exactly what the Westerner does, right? And what the cowboy character does. So for me, I show this to my students because, one, it's a very interesting movie, and also kind of scratches the itch for, as they say, like, I like my movies darker, and whatever that means. We can talk more about that as things go on. I'm a hopeless romantic, but it also shows that I like thinking about not Westerns as a label or a brand that you brand on a certain thing and say, that's a Western, right? And that thing's not, it doesn't belong in this herd, but it is a lens through which you look at a film and say, how does this align with or change my perspective on this particular genre? Seeing that two characters, one who's very aligned with the gangster and noir genre, and one that's very aligned with the Western frontier, as well as the setting, which is very much a frontier town, but the way that it's approached is, how can I get money and raise my way up in this frontier town, which is a very Westerner thing, allows us to use these different lenses to see something more come out about this movie than just, is it yes or is it no to a particular genre. So I wanted to share that because I think, especially coming from someone who's not a cinephile for Westerns, seeing the way of looking at this as a generic lens can really lend a different perspective on films that even don't seem to be Western in their approach, but could be useful to be thought of in that way.
There's a lot of interesting points there. I think that it strikes me that with this subversion that we're getting here of kind of like this, if we're looking at through that Western lens of kind of what we would have had as kind of the Western hero archetype, specifically, I suppose, through Tim Holt's character, but then also kind of how that ties into Dobbs, and something that I think is developing here, and I think is definitely a part of the gangster film of the noir, is that nature of obsession that we get. And that definitely develops as we kind of continue into the post-war Westerns. And this is an interesting crossover because that becomes very much a part of these stories. And I think that's a key element of all of this. And I like the idea of this, fitting into this as kind of like this introduction to all of this, because it is this nice early crossover of a few different genres that kind of, it still fits in kind of the American dream and this idea of easy wealth in the West. Like that was one of the reasons people were going west, because there's gold in them there hills, right? Like they wanted to get out there to mine for gold, or easy wealth, just taking a huge swath of land and making it my own and raising these cattle, and I'm gonna be a well-to-do rancher now, and that kind of is the whole idea of all of this. And there's a big critique in like that myth of the American dream and just like this sort of story. And so it's a great introduction to this to everything that we're going to be talking about here.
Yeah. And I will say, ideologically speaking, I find it very interesting that the one person that both Bob Curtin, the cowboy, and Dobbs, the gangster, beat up is the capitalist who's like, hey, I'm exploiting your labor, and then tries to get away with it. They both beat him up, take his money. And that's showing as, yes, from a Western justice American way, you don't do labor without someone paying you for that. And from a gangster American way, you've ripped me off, I'm going to kill you, right? Which is very interesting to think about, like how both of these play with, and we'll see this throughout the rest of these films too, the realities of making money and living in the West becomes a question, especially with the when you become the rancher. Then you get this power dynamic where it's like, I don't know you're the good guy anymore, because the good guy of a Western has nothing to his name but a song and a gun and goes from town to town, not the person who controls all this land and says, I am the king, which again, Americans ought to be against, at least the versions of this Western. So yeah, I think I want to point that as well, that there's something going on with the idea of who has the power and who has the money, and why we should caution one or the other, which I think will come up in our next one too.
Yeah, that's a great point. To that end, let's move into our next film. We're really kicking things off here in the post-war Western. It's not the 50s, but we're still in the 40s, but definitely like post-war, we're starting to get that feel as that post-war, the feelings from the war, everyone's coming home and there's a vibe that everything is shifting. And here we are talking about Howard Hawks' film, Red River from 1948, stepping away from the moral shadowlands of the Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And this is kind of like the cusp of a new era for the Western hero. We're seeing how the classical hero archetype begins to fracture in this film under the weight of authority, reputation, personal trauma. This film follows Thomas Dunson, played by John Wayne, as he leads a massive cattle drive. I mean, it's spectacular how this film is shot. It blew me away. From Texas to Missouri, accompanied by his adopted son, Matthew Garth, played by Montgomery Clift, and a big crew of cowhands. Along the way, tensions rise between Dunson and Garth as the older man's tyrannical leadership style clashes with his son's more humane approach. We're setting the stage for the collapse of the heroic ideal here that we're going to see unfold over this genre. I'd love to hear you kind of talk a little bit about kind of that and how this film is really setting the stage for that.
Yeah, great way to put it too, setting the stage, because I think really this was set with John Wayne's other Westerns, including Stagecoach, which I mentioned in the history portion as well, where he plays the your typical gunslinger, but a good-hearted guy who will even accept the prostitute into the world, right? And sort of a naive way, but in a way that I think is like, hey, everyone's at the table. He's done a lot of Ford Westerns or a lot of Ford films, and then we get to Howard Hawks, which puts him in this film, and later Ford will say, I didn't know the son of a bitch could act, because he's put into a role where he really gets to chew the scenery and be someone who is even more than his other films, not saying there weren't other like questionable behavior in his other films, more morally gray. So I like that you said this is the kind of the questioning of the hero archetype, because we see that from the very beginning. Like John Wayne comes out with his friend Nadine Groot, played by Walter Brennan, who is this great character actor sort of thing. She'll show up in other films as well. they're going on this travel, and he decides he's going to leave the wagon train so he can start a ranch, knowing that there are Native Americans in the area that will kill them. And he says to his wife, "I got to go anyway." And later on finds out that the Native Americans pretty much killed everyone on the wagon train except for him, because he gets his wife's bracelet later on, which is, that's very dark and very like sudden, in a way that I think is not super surprising for Howard Hawks, who is the guy behind Scarface, right? But he's also maybe surprising because he also did Bringing Up Baby. Howard Hawks does this very interesting thing with a bunch of genres, and The Big Sleep, To Have and Have Not. So there are lots of things that get in there that kind of feel weird. But then the first thing he does is he goes and he says, "This land is mine." He gets approached by people who say this is Don Diego's land, and Don Diego got it from the King of Spain. And he says, "You got it from the Native Americans who were here before and actually are still here," right? That's something that they always miss, is like, nations are still around, right? It's not a past thing. This is who are here now. And then he shoots the guy and says one of the guys, and says the other guy, "Go back and tell your master that I have this land," and we never hear from them again. So it essentially, there's no way to read this to me that isn't like, he's a colonizer, he's an imperialist, like immediately comes in, "This is my kingdom, I'm killing someone," and that's that. Which you didn't really get with earlier ones, and is beginning to question this. But then that kind of gets like put under the, water under the bridge, because it's John Wayne and he's the guy we're supposed to root for. And once he gets more Ahab-like, I'm going to go here where I'm not believing what anyone else says, we get more of a chance for Matt, who stands by his side and then eventually says, "You've gone too far," to take over and then allow him to have this obsession to follow him through. So I think there is this degradation of the heroic image of John Wayne, but Matt does pretty well for himself, and he seems pretty straightforward. He's the guy everyone seems to like, and he follows, and he falls in love with a girl. The second half of the film just turns into, not Bringing Up Baby, but it's a Hawks comedy, right? And a romantic comedy by the end. He does have this tension with John Ireland's Cherry Valance. I will say tension because there's a scene in this film that a lot of people mention, especially knowing Montgomery Clift's sexuality later on, where it is a shooting contest, where they're just saying like, "Hey, that's a nice gun you have there. Can I see it? Yeah, here's my gun. Can you see it? Hey, how well can you do with it?" And they're saying, "Hey, that's pretty good." And they're firing off at different things. So there seems to be a tension there that I think is supposed to be set up as a rivalry. But then by the end of the film, at least according to the sources I found, Howard Hawks had a falling out with John Ireland. So he's like, "You're not going to have too many more lines." And eventually he just comes up for some weird reason and says, "I'm going to shoot you, John Wayne." And John Wayne kills him, which is different what the original book is. So John Wayne has such charisma. He changes the narrative to kill this guy that Howard Hawks didn't like, and then has this fight with Matt. That is a really interesting dynamic that we see later, of the old man and the young pup kind of coming up as the Western stuff. This is where masculinity is grown. So I think that it does show the degradation, but it also allows the main character to say, "I do not want to be that in the future," and go away from it.
Yeah, I think, we've talked a bit about masculinity throughout this, and certainly when you were seeing things like the essentially the pissing contest between the two guys as far as who can shoot better, exchanging guns and all that. But what I found really interesting in this film that I think ties into that in some way, and I think also ties into evolution of a society, is the paternal authority that we have here. Mm-hmm. This is a father figure here, and now the son is pushing back against that. And wanting to, seeing that the dad is doing things in an old way, an old style that doesn't work anymore, and is trying to shift all of that, and does, in fact, kind of shift all of that. And that is an element of kind of just like the evolution of a society as well. And I think that's one of the things that I found so interesting about this story, is how it takes this father-son relationship and uses that as just kind of a lens to look at societal evolution and moving forward and finding ways to improve and better ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that this is an important bit that comes through the Western and how it is shared. It's not exactly an oral narrative now. We're in the age of movies, but a lot of my students who say, "Oh, I've seen Westerns," it's because my dad or my grandfather loved Westerns, and I
Yeah.
shared it. They shared it with me, and this goes beyond gender lines because a lot of my best students in these are young women who really love the Western for whatever reason it is. But I think that there is an idea of I'm passing down what it means to be a man. And for a lot of people, what it means to be a man in America is John Wayne, as problematic as that might be. But I think seeing someone who is seeing John Wayne, this big, larger than life character, do things he doesn't like and still stand up to him is really interesting. And he almost gets killed for it, right?
Right,
John
yeah.
Wayne tries to get him to draw. He shoots multiple times, and then he throws his gun down, starts punching the guy, and then they punch back, and that's when Dean Groot, Walter Brennan, says, like, I knew this was going to work out because now the kid punched back, which is showing how violence in this world becomes part of what makes you a man, and is only stopped by, I think it's, is it Tess or is it Finn? Matt's love interest, who comes in, I think it is Tess, and shoots and says, shoots at them and says, "Stop it! You weren't going to kill each other anyway. This is stupid." And then essentially they say, "Yeah, that's fine," which is really weird and very comedic, like in a Howard Hawks way for this ending, which again is very different than the dramatic ending we had before. But I think also shows that like a lot of the pissing contests, as you say, that we see of this. Are just that. They are rituals that don't really mean a lot when it comes down to it at the end of the day, and yet still have so much power for creating what makes an American man an American man.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing that is so interesting is like the American man is kind of like the Western hero, right? Like that's kind of this whole ideal. Like that is the American man. I mean, Marlboro made billions off of that whole concept of like the lone cowboy out there on the ranch smoking his cigarettes. And here we have this beginning to kind of shift where I think that there's this the authority that figure has. We're all starting to question, is that okay? And I think that over the next few films, I think we're going to be seeing that as well as we kind of discuss as we kind of move forward.
And this is the late 40s, but this is presaging a lot of the boomer, like the post-war baby boom, where you have a lot more teenagers and leisure time much later into the 50s and the 60s, where you get a lot of them saying like, I don't care about you, Dad. So there's a lot of issues there of the rebellious youth that I think would connect for this. Like I was not around at this time, but I can imagine a father showing their son this on television, if it came out on television in the 50s at a right time, and then saying like, we had that dynamic and problematically, had to fight about it. But that is an interesting thing that we will see throughout the rest of these. And I think that's why to repeat what I said before, guys shooting guns on horses is such a good way of thinking about what things of the Western are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump into Henry King's 1950 film, The Gunfighter. This psychological Western further challenges this traditional hero archetype and presents a protagonist haunted by his own reputation and seeking redemption. This film stars Gregory Peck as Jimmy Ringo, a notorious gunslinger who tries to put his violent past behind him and reconcile with his estranged wife and son. However, his reputation as the fastest gun in the West follows him wherever he goes, drawing challenges from young upstarts and complicating his life as he attempts a peaceful life. How does this film build upon these themes of kind of heroic disillusionment, moral complexity that really we're just talking about in Red River? We're starting to kind of see all of that emerge.
Yeah. We'll see a lot of this like young pup, older gunslinger dynamic as we go through. But I think The Gunfighter and in 1950 is a really great way of showing the post-war approach to this. Like this is a guy who has seen war and seen killing. He has 11, almost 12 kills to his name, and he doesn't love it, right? And the thing he doesn't love is the reputation that comes with it, right? And the fact that he cannot do the things he wanted to do, right? It's kind of showing this as an Arrested Development sense, right? Like, hey, it's fun to, as the Marshal Mark Strett, played by Millard Mitchell, who will also come up in Winchester 73, as a is kind of the foil for Jimmy Ringo. Jimmy Ringo still kept doing his thing, or had to, because of his reputation, keep firing on and going from place to place, while Marshal Mark Strett, who didn't have quite enough of a reputation, was able to settle down and become the marshal of this place and kind of put that behind him. Jimmy Ringo sees Mark, and they have these discussions that are saying like, oh, I want to be with you. I want to be like you. I want to push this all away, but now I can't because I went too far. And versus all these young kids who, at the very beginning, we get Eddie, who's just trying to insult him at every stage. Everyone's saying, don't do it. It's dumb. And there have been so many ways to walk away. Jimmy said so many, Jimmy Ringo's Gregory Peck, Gregory Peck's Jimmy Ringo, that is, said so many ways to let him go. And then finally, like, he has to kill him. That is something we don't actually see Gregory Peck draw. It's so fast. The editing is such where we see the other guy draw, and then a shot goes off, and then we see the smoking gun from the other side, which I think is a really cool way of showing this character's prestige. But I think how this kind of evolves is, as opposed to Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which we had 2 full men. This is about men fighting men. And Red River, which has the young pup who is like grown up with this guy. So it's really a father-son dynamic. You get the older folks, really the veterans, the people who've come back from the war, and then the young kids who are saying, isn't it cool that you were in the war? Like, how many people did you kill? And even the civilians do this, like the bartender of the Palace bar. Great name for this. He's just stuck in the Palace, which is very metaphorical in its own way. His keeps trying to say like, hey, remember this? Like, didn't you do this? Which is kind of showing what the public at home was also like for people coming back from war as well. And I think there is a discussion here of like, this is a curse. It's not a heroic thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think we see that really at the end, where literally Ringo, Gregory Peck's Ringo, gives a dying curse to the snot-nosed kid, Hunt Bromley. It's such a great snot-nosed kid. He even has a little mustache. It's like he's doing his best.
He's perfect.
And Gregory Peck's mustache, which was a bit of a contention among
one,
Zanuck was like, Zanuck was like, no, I do not like this at all. I'm fine with it, but I can understand why people hate the mustache. Anyway, the fact that his dying words are, there's a chance for him to say, hey, this person's being arrested, which was actually what the ending of the movie was before Zanuck came in. He says, no, I give you my name and I want you to live with it and see how a terrible life you have, is showing that this is a curse, and is literally like going back to the deepest myths that we have. It is a death curse upon the person that killed you, that I think really resonates with the tainting power of violence that we haven't quite got in something like the 1930s films, where everyone is having a great time shooting Native Americans like at their fish in a barrel, or shooting bad guys like, I'm not sure of John Wayne's kill count in Stagecoach, or even Red River. Red River is a little bit more wary about this because there's like social dynamics when he kills somebody. But it's not a B Western, kill as many people as you can, and it's fine. It is every kill deals more damage, right? Like, I think John Wayne probably has at least 11 kills in Stagecoach, but you get this person who is so haunted by the 11 and 12 kids because he knows who he killed, and as a guy who tries to kill him as a revenge for his son, he knows who he didn't kill. Shows you a little bit more about how violence plays into this.
Well, and just there's a sadness in the reality of this story where his 11 or 12 kills wouldn't include Native Americans at that particular point in time. Like if John Wayne were doing, if like his character in Stagecoach were doing a count of who he'd killed, none of those people would count. And that's kind of just a tragedy in the way that these stories are. Cause I think, I mean, had this Ringo, had he actually, killed any Native Americans, he probably wouldn't be counting them either in his 11 or 12, right? So that's just kind of like
absolutely
a reality in all of this. There's an element here of the nature of escaping one's past that I think is so important. And we've talked about this yearning to be part of society, and that's a big part of what he's looking for here, right?
Yeah.
Like, he wants to get out of this so that he can be back with his wife and son, and that's his whole thing. And I think this is really kind of our first step into kind of the darker endings that we're going to see, where it's not necessarily a happy ending. Like, it ends with him getting killed, and as you said, passing his curse on to this young person who shot him. That's kind of how it ends. It's very dark, and I think as kind of like this classic hero archetype that we've been exploring, this is kind of the realities of what it means to have stepped into the shoes of that archetype and realizing it's not all cut out for what it's not what it's cut out for,
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think it is a matter of it is a very dark ending for the way that this approaches, but you can see it is a dark and an optimistic world, because it wasn't like you were doomed from the start. There was a chance. There was this chance you could have done it, and what kept you back was this stupid kid's point of glory, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
Now him getting the curse is kind of an earned curse, right? Like, that is the God has cursed you because, or like the world has cursed you because you transgressed, because you did this. And it is something that, like, the cycle of violence is not going to stop, but we do get at the end Peggy coming in and saying, I am Mrs. Ringo, and like stepping up and and his son knows too, right? His son says, and his son, in a way that's like, the violence is over. This was a bad thing, but now we can continue to grow. And the person who's going to get punished for this is Hunt Bromley, who had it coming, right? He's the kid who shot him in the back. Like, this is the thing. And if the rules of the West are anything that I think people would know at this point, shooting someone in the back doesn't really count as a kill, right? But so the whole town knows he didn't really do it. But what Jimmy Ringo makes sure he does is says, I drew first, right? Just to make sure you're the one who got caught, right? Which I think is a very dark way of approaching this, but also it is more of a parable than anything else that I feel like is not as bleak as we'll see in some other ones, as bleak as it is for Gregory Peck and his mustache.
But, and your point about his wife and son kind of saying who they are at the end of the film, I think there is that glimmer of a society, moving forward that we have here. Because, I mean, earlier in the film, and a scene that I really enjoy, where it's all the women, like, it's the Old West. There's no internet. Nobody knows who anybody actually looks like. They just know the myth of this person. They know the myth of this Ringo, and they come into the sheriff's office, and he's there, and they're telling him, he's here in town. We've got to do something about it. And then when the sheriff comes back in, he introduces them, and they're all like, oh my God, like, this is the guy. And we end up in that scene, and we don't get to see the resolution of that, but the fact that his wife says that, and everybody, like, it stops being a myth at that point, and it turns into a real human being that was dealing with these issues. And I'd like to think that moving forward, they would find a more positive way to kind of like look at him as a man, as somebody who is struggling and everything, and accept his wife and son for who they are too. And so I think that maybe there's a glimmer of kind of hope for society moving forward.
And this is, in some ways, can be read as a parable for American history itself, right? It's not just saying, oh, remember when we were so cool and we conquered the West and how cool that was? But it's like, hey, we did a lot of violence. And the people we've done have suffered for it, and other people have suffered for it. We didn't quite get to the other people have suffered for it in this film. But it is a matter of, like, now that I can admit this is our past, we can go forward knowing, hey, let's not think about this cycle further. And then again, most of the people at that funeral showed up because they're showing up for the myth, right? They're showing up for the myth and not the person. The people who matter, though, do know. And I think especially that we have this young kid. Again, we see a lot of young boys or young pups looking up at these characters. So it's very much like if people have, I think one of my students once said, like, Westerns are a very dad genre. They're not wrong, right? It's because it's very much about like masculinity, what it means to be a man, passing it on to the next generation, in ways that they're struggling with. I think that showing the young kid saying, I am proudly this, but also knowing his dad is dead, and not like, I'm going to get you, Hunt Bromley. Like, they had a moment to say that. It doesn't seem like that is the issue here. The issue is like, my dad died because of guns. Like, maybe he's going to become someone that thinks about it this way. But it is an interesting thing that leaves an open question in a way that is very much in the American. There are many paths out there possible, except for the one who is punished, right? Hunt Bromley is punished to this unlife that he's probably not going to do very well at. He's probably going to get shot the next time because he's not a good shot.
I mean, he had to do it by shooting him in the back. So yeah. Speaking of violence in stories, let's shift to Anthony Mann's 1950 classic, Winchester 73. This film further explores the psychological complexities and moral ambiguities of the Western hero through the lens of a man's obsessive quest for revenge and a legendary rifle. The story follows Lynn McAdam, played by James Stewart, as he pursues a stolen prize rifle and the man who killed his father. Along the way, the rifle changes hands several times, revealing the dark desires and violent impulses that lie beneath the surface of the Western landscape. How does this film kind of deepen what we've been talking about, like this whole post-war Western's exploration of this flawed hero, and I guess even really kind of this psychological toll of violence, which, I mean, as you said, that's the big part. That's him shooting guns, right?
Yeah. No, that's the shooting guns part. And I think I'm so glad he brought this one up, because it had been on my list and I hadn't had an excuse to watch it when I originally had presented this, because I was talking about Anthony Mann's films like The Furies, which I really like. He brings up, originally I had positioned one that we'll talk about when we get to some of the super Westerns, as Bazan would call them, thinking about like I'm completely missing it. The Naked Spur. I almost called it the Naked Gun every single time. It's not the Naked Gun. Like this tone, is more, not maybe a Western. Who knows? Different sort of work, but this one feels like the most pulpy and folkloric of the films at this in our list, in a way that is less mythic and more folkloric, because it feels like a dime novel with a chapter for each of these things, right? It has, right. It touches on, the same way a lot of B Westerns do, or at least a lot of B Westerns that we would get on, all the tropes that you need. It's like almost contractually obligated. There needs to be Wyatt Earp in there. They mention Custer. They talk about, we meet the cavalry. We meet a prostitute with a heart of gold. We meet an outlaw, and our main protagonist has a beef with that outlaw, who happen to be brothers, right? We have our sidekick, which is High Spade Frankie Wilson, and that name itself. All this is iconic. Like, you have Dutch Henry Brown, High Spade Frankie Wilson. You have a lot of these very stylized approach. We have a shooting contest where he wins because he shoots through a little amulet and then has to put through a postage stamp on that amulet. We have multiple standoffs. There are an Indian trader playing a solitaire game while discussing like what they're going to pay for the guns. It feels like everything but a poker game is in this. A poker game and a bar fight is in this film, and it does so by I think really expertly making the main character of the story this gun that goes from hand to hand and shows you really a tableau of the West. Even though it is James Stewart's as Lynn McAdam's story, it really is the story of this gun and the story of guns in the West itself. So I think like if I had to point anyone to a film that kind of said, okay, what do you mean by this is what the Western is? Here are all the tropes right in front of you. That said, I think the idea that we said before with the gunfighter, this dying curse parable thing, with the dying curse is a very folkloric term. This idea of this cursed object that goes from person to person, or kind of a dark version of the Sword and the Stone, where it's like only the righteous can wield it, and it corrupts everybody else. Because Lynn McAdam, we think at the end, will be able to wield it right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and Wyatt Earp could wield it. He says, "I might, but I'm not gonna, because I'm the good guy, right?" He's our, if we're going to pull like Tolkien into this, he's our Tom Bombadil of the story, who could absolutely destroy this ring, but says, "No, let's have it for everybody else." But yeah, it is interesting, and yet it's not. It is not dark like a dying curse, because we don't get any inkling that James Stewart is going to now die or be cursed because of this object that has cursed everybody else, because he got it the right way. He got it through competence, which is what Western men ought to have, and he uses it for good and justice, which is what Western men ought to do, right? In these regards. So I think it is very folkloric is the way I approach it, and I really like it for that reason in itself. That said, I mean, you're right. Stewart is more violent and disillusioned than he was in Destry Rides Again, who was very much this sort of thing. And we will see, if you watch any of the other movies that Mann and Stewart did together, Bend of the River, Naked Spur, The Far Country, and The Man from Laramie, which we had to choose one.
I know.
I think we chose the right one, though, for this list. That becomes more and more dark as we go. Like in The Naked Spur, people think, oh, you're the sheriff, that's why you're going after this guy. But no, he kind of lies to them because he's this bounty hunter this whole time. I think really the only darkness we get with Lynn McAdam here is his desire for revenge because his brother killed his dad, which he kind of would say, you come to the light side, it'll be okay, sort of. And then he just wins by pure... it is a really cool like fight scene there where they're just ricocheting and trying to get things right. They're both taught by the same guy, and it's very, it feels very mythic in that way. But I think again, I pull towards folkloric on that. But also, I think he does. He says say he worked for the Confederacy, which at the time anyway, in the 50s, I think was still not as negative as we would see it today, but is something where I think the general populace was still like, nah, that's not a good thing that they did. But the Sergeant Wilkes, I think, is the guy who is the Union general, says, hey, I wish you would have had, you would have been there at, I think it was Bull Run. And then he says, I was on the other side. And then they're like, ha, and they shake hands as a way that only two white men that are not enslaved folks could do after the Civil War, a sort of approach. So there is that sort of thing. But besides that, he's still a pretty like white hat kind of guy, just with a little bit more of a drive.
Yeah, it's that end that really changes things, because he refuses to do anything but track down and kill his brother. Like it's
true.
Like it is an obsession that he has. And I think that's, if we're tracking the gun as being kind of like this central figure that is we're watching as it goes from person to person, and each of them ends in a dark way. I think what we're seeing here is really kind of like, and I think this actually ties perfectly into Treasure of the Sierra Madre, like this this mirror of human desire. Like, I have to have this thing, and it's, you know, for Dobbs, it's like this gold, I have to have this gold, that drove him crazy. And here, all of these people, I mean, man, they are obsessed with this Winchester 73. I mean, it is like the perfect gun. Like, there's a lot of things about it that, I mean, the whole opening describes like why this gun happens to be such a perfectly made gun and everything. And I don't even know if half the people who end up with it actually know all of this. It just looks like a damn nice gun, and so they want it, you know. And when the terribly cast Rock Hudson as the Native American
young bull
wants it,
oh my gosh,
it's like he just wants it because it looks like such a great gun. And that's really where we go. And because they want it so bad, the way they get it is violence, and then the way they defend it is violence. It's all about the violence in every moment that we have.
Yeah, and ironically enough, the reason that Stewart resists this sort of thing is because, I mean, I think if this was directed by Sergio Leone, Stewart's character would be, I want that gun, and I will kill you too. Probably, at one point, like, Stewart gets the chance after they fight Rock Hudson as Young Bull. Oh my gosh, that's
so bad.
I'll say it. Like, Redface comes up in a lot of these films, and we'll see this in many different ways in Unfortunate Places. That's some of the reasons why I wouldn't like assign this film in my class as much, is because I think I do assign the searchers to talk about how this sort of works, but seeing Rock Hudson, it's just one, it really throws things off for me. But also, it is one of those things where it's like, we have a lot we can talk about on this. I'm not sure this is the time. And it's not something to just push aside and say, like, yeah, that's what they did. But in this case, it is, they're not even giving the particular band of people a name, right? It's just the Native Americans that they say in here, which is, it's unfortunate part of all this. Versus they have the opportunity with the character of the quote unquote Indian trader who does act as this liaison and way of talking about these things, that allows folks to have more agency. And I think the reason, if I remember correctly, and I might be wrong, the reason that Young Bull wants this is because the Indian trader says this is the same thing that Custer used. And so he wants revenge for Custer. So the Custer myth kind of approaches this. It's kind of like saying, yes, this is the weapon of this great hero, though he's not a hero. They would say it this way. It's one of 1,000. They say President Grant has one, Buffalo Bill has one, and one of them's here, is one of the ways they make this a very desirable image. But it also has that folkloric quality of a lot of magic items where it is something that, it has this power because it has a story to it. And the story is so big, we need to make it the title of the movie, right? Which is like, I am not a gun owner. I don't know. I don't know one gun from another. But you say Winchester 73, and you force it in my face like this. Now I know, that's the repeating rifle we're going to go for. So I think it is something where it is interesting that Lynn's desire to get revenge, which is justice, right? That is his hunger, is more than his desire for power, which is this gun. He, at one point, after as I was saying, after the Native American raid, the guy says, yeah, you can take whatever you want. And he says, don't have time, gotta go. And it gets handed over to this guy who's kind of a coward, and gets shot and killed for it. And then gets eventually back to it. It's like the gun is important to follow the story, but it's not really as important that he gets the gun back. It's just important he gets the guy who has the gun, which I think it does show a difference between this and some of the more Dobbsian character, in that, like, again, he is pure of heart in that way, even though his pure of heart is working for the Confederacy, shooting Native Americans for anything, and then killing this guy in cold blood for revenge sake, still counts as pure of heart in the Western logic.
Well, and just like John Wayne in Stagecoach, he befriends the prostitute with the heart of gold, right? Like,
absolutely, yeah.
Like that's a big part of this story, is like that relation. Like, he defends her at one point, and then ends up kind of like saving her, and that becomes a key relationship in the development of the story.
Oh yeah, it's really interesting that they establish that relationship when she gets off the carriage, and he's like, you stay away from, like, is there a problem here, officer, sort of thing, lets her go. And then we see her with this guy who, as soon as that guy is on stage, I'm like, he's dead, right? Like, because there's no way in the classical Hollywood logic to have this go any other way. He's going to be shown to be not as competent, not a full Westerner, and thus not worth the love of the prostitute with the heart of gold character, which I'm sure we will talk about as we get into, like, Johnny Guitar and things like that, who is the ideal match, it seems, for a Westerner of his caliber, right? So it is interesting that, like, he signed his death warrant as soon as he was on screen, just by the logic of these things. At least for me, having watched a lot of these, I wonder how my students would see it.
This film also gives us a variety. I mean, he's a great example of the characters that end up with the gun. But what I love about it is that we get to see such a variety of characters over the course of the story. And Dan Duryea is one of my
Waco
favorites.
Johnny Beans.
When he ends up with it, because he is just like, he's just so crazy. And I think that, in the scope of the Western, we always hear about this type of character, right? And like the hot-headed, the guy who's ready to just kind of like take down everything and stab people in the back and do whatever he needs to. And in the scope of this story, I think it's another example of just the sort of person who is going to get drawn in when the violence, in the form of this gun, but just violence, these situations present themselves. Like he's not somebody who's looking to settle down. He's dirty and he's mean, and that's kind of his world.
He's dirty, he's mean, and he has a lot of fun fighting the law. Right? Like the scene that we get where he's toying with Steve to get him to do the thing. And then he does the thing. He is not the sort of calculating villain we'll get later. And he's certainly not the Ben Wade of 3:10 to Yuma, who is so charming. He's actually like had an ethical center. This guy is kind of a man of chaos who's like, oh, cool, a woman and a cool gun. Oh yeah, there's a guy, I'll kill him, and then we'll continue on. He's
but
a
first
good
I'm going to have him make
have.
me some tea and put on an apron.
Absolutely. It is one of those things where he is a great diabolical character who is just one of the many that we kind of miss because we're going through these so much. I think they do a good job of giving him just enough time. Again, it's like the dime novel chapter where we are introduced to this cool character and we move on, is I think a really cool way of approaching this. So yeah, Dan Duryea is a really good approach to this. I like, and again, Waco Johnny, right? Like there's another great thing. And you don't see, and that's the other thing that I really like about this film into our mix, is you don't see a lot of those nicknames in the other films that we get. In Johnny Guitar, they're used as a joke, sort of as a joke, but also as a like alias sort of thing. And in other ones, though, I feel like the dime novel tradition, the B movie tradition, you're getting a lot more of these very like Western sounding nicknames that kind of give you a drawl when you say them, right? High Spade, Frankie Wilson. He says High Spade, Frankie Wilson with a hyphen. That's what I sit on when I'm tired, which is like so much a Western protagonist thing that I really liked about this movie, that is different than the sort of psychological realism you get from the gunfighter, right? Like there are some, they know him as Jimmy Ringo, and that's like as close as we get to what the nickname would be, just Jimmy. So it becomes like, it doesn't really fit in a lot of these, which is why I like this as folkloric rather than mythic, rather than historical or psychological, the way of approaching it. But I'm not sure I've had anyone say it's a folkloric Western the same way, and I'd have to make a good argument for that. But still, that's the way I approach it.
Well, it's an interesting approach, because I think that in the scope of myth and folklore, I think there is an element in just the storytelling style and what we're trying to draw from those tales, and how we see it, and I think, and how we see ourselves in those stories, and I think that the folk, I think that it's interesting. I guess I've never really thought too much about the difference between the two, but I think that I'd have to stew on it a little bit. But I think that there's enough of a difference between the two that gives you a sense of the grandeur, perhaps, of the way that you view the story, and the morals of what you're looking at for what the story's about and everything.
Yeah, I think for me to think about those things, and maybe why I say these sort of things, mythic usually approaches to something that could have been real in a mythic past, and at least in its power is just as real as things are. Folklore is received wisdom put into individual smaller stories that have resonance within the culture, and sometimes can turn into myth or be incorporated into myths, right? But you'll hear like tall tales or more folklore, like this guy wrestled a bear with one hand, sort of thing, which is not super mythic in the same way as like your Wyatt Earp is kind of more mythic. He's like the great gunfighter and great this sort of thing, versus your Paul Bunyan feels more like folklore sort of approach. But the tall tales in the Western, this doesn't necessarily feel like a tall tale, but it does definitely feel like connection between the two.
Yeah. Let's move forward. We're going to talk about Fred Zinnemann's 1952 classic, High Noon. This film shifts our focus to the theme, really kind of civic duty and the individual's struggle against societal apathy and cowardice. This story unfolds in real time, mostly, following Marshal Will Kane, played by Gary Cooper, as he faces a looming confrontation with a gang of outlaws. Despite his efforts to rally support from the townspeople he's long protected, Kane finds himself increasingly isolated and abandoned, forced to confront the impending threat alone. This film, we're challenging the Western's narrative of the hero and their relationship to the community, which I think is just such an interesting part of it. And, especially because we've talked about some of these films that they say, oh, the closest sheriff is 200 miles away. Here we've got the sheriff in town with the community. He's been here protecting them. But it also talks about kind of the moral responsibility and how people view that. What is this film saying in the scope of all of that, and the hero and how the hero ties into it?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think I'm looking back. I don't think so far we've had a lawman as our main character here. No, none of these are lawmen so far, which was something much more common in other westerns as well. And High Noon is the first one on this list that we have our main character being someone who follows the law and is following the law for his own reasons. A lot of this isn't really how do I put this? The reason he wants to kill Frank Miller or shoot Frank Miller dead is because he knows he's going to come and he's going to cause problems for the town, not just for him, right? And that's kind of the reason he turns around, besides his own, like, I need to do it because that's what a man's got to do. I think that this movie with Shane and Johnny Guitar is one that the film critic Andre Bazin has called a super western. In his essay, The Evolution of the Western, he talks about how he likes the old B-western sort of things, and he sees a shift now in two different directions. One is more of the novelistic westerns, which he is pulling a lot of Anthony Mann's westerns, which are kind of taking the same tropes and building them further and having, like, just like in Winchester 73, there's a lot of individual characters and we're building onto those things, except in the ones he's thinking about, there's a smaller cast of characters. So you're not like rolling through them just like you are in Winchester 73. But more of it's taking the old tropes of like B-westerns and these things and moving them to here. He calls High Noon and Shane super westerns, which are westerns that are not satisfied just being westerns. These are westerns being used for some other reason. And you can see that very much in High Noon, which is very much an allegory for HUAC. We have the writer who is essentially says, yes, I was a communist, and then gets pulled off of the thing. And there's a big falling out with his director partner because of his desire to state what he believes, and everyone else around him who were his friends saying, no, I'm not going to stay with you because you're in trouble. And either I'm going to get hurt, or, you know what, I don't think I really believe this is a good thing, or it's not good for the town. That's kind of what the mayor and the church say. It's like, we need to think about what Washington's going to think about this town. We were put on the map. We don't want to be the one that killed somebody in the middle of the streets, right? And I think like this idea of Gary Cooper, who again is pulling from I see in the chat, there's a lot of people who want to chat too, and I see you, but we'll see if we can get through all 12. Gary Cooper, which is coming back from the Virginian and the Westerner, is a much older man now, right? He is dressed in all black to show he's like solitary throughout all this thing. So you've gotten this moment where you have, not quite in the same way that the gunfighter character is regretting his decisions, but this is a guy who did his tenure, needs to do the hard things to survive in this world, because in an ideal world, no one would be causing problems. But here, he has to stick with what he did because that's what he believes in, and he has to carry on with. And he's making the decision that no one else, as it turns out, can make or will make. And everyone avoids him for it in a way that I think, for me, I feel like a couple of American presidents really like this film, and I can see why. They see themselves as Will Kane. Like, everyone's saying, I've abandoned you, or like, I don't like what you're doing, or these sort of things. But someone's got to fire the gun when the bad guy comes to town. Like when someone, and this is how I approached it to my students, right, this is very questioning the role of violence much as it is the role of masculinity. It's like, yes, I think a lot of us can agree now that the sort of masculinity that you just throw your life away because I didn't like him once, and I got to do something about it. The sort of thing that people in the gunfighter are killed and like derided for, just like don't perceive slight, is bad. But also, if no one else is going to stop someone coming into town and causing a ruckus and pretty much running the thing the way they want, who's going to do it? Someone has to. Gets a question of like, how does violence actually pull into this thing?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and how the entirety of the society kind of views all of that and what is right, and
Yeah.
for them, they think what's right is like, oh, we need you to leave because we'll be safer. And is that actually right? Like the way that, if Frank comes to town, is he actually going to leave them alone and race off to catch Kane? Who knows? But that's kind of what they see as right. I think,
Yeah.
What's his name? Thomas Mitchell as the mayor, his little speech that he gives in front of the congregation in the church. I think that says so much about how people view all of this, and this idea that like it's just brilliantly constructed, because you don't see that shift that suddenly he has, where because you think that he's standing beside Kane, and then the whole thing shifts and he's actually not, and he's just like, you're in the wrong, you got to get out of here, because you're going to make it worse for all of us. And I think, again, also, I think there's an element that you can look at in kind of like post-war societal pressures, people coming back who need work, and now we're trying to get all of these people back into the workforce. How can we kind of integrate all of that? Plus, you've got McCarthyism coming in, and you've got just kind of a shift in family dynamics, and all of that is happening here. And here you have this sheriff who, I mean, he is the lone force here who is going to protect them. And he just marries a Quaker who is completely against violence, and has to kind of shift her own beliefs through, because this town won't help. I think that it's saying a lot about kind of like just, how people are viewing civic duty, and you're like, you're not standing up by our side. And I think, I don't know, it still is something that you can, I mean, it's as relevant today as it is back then. This type of story, it's there's a lot to contemplate with that.
And I think it comes down to, like, I was saying at the very beginning of our conversation that for me, the Western is what happens when you have these ideals and have to put them into practicality and what they actually mean, right? And we see that with Grace Kelly's character, who's very young at this point, who is a pacifist. And the reason she's a pacifist, because like her brother and her dad died because of gun violence, and she actually is standing ground and saying, Will, I'm not going to stay with you. If you're going to do this, like you said, you'd put this away. I understood that before. You're not going to do it now. And she's standing by her morals. She changes her mind at the last minute because she had this connection with Helen Ramirez, who's a fantastically acted character, but also like a very interesting character. Has this relationship with Gary Cooper. Again, like the okay, I'll come back to the prostitute trope again, but the fact that she says, in practicality, I either have to choose of getting the person that I love killed again, or standing up and fighting for it, is really interesting as a place where, like, well, practicality, idealism doesn't really stand in practicality. You have to make your whole moral center around something and decide it. And on the other hand, Will Kane is rewarded for his decision to do idealism rather than practicality, right? He could leave. Practically, he could run, right? And practically, he could save the town, perhaps, right? There's a good chance of that. But he stands by, if I don't, bad things will happen, which is also kind of a practical response, or at least one that he's betting one or another, that I think makes this much harder to just dismiss as, this is a machismo, I'm going to go against these sort of things. And I think especially when we're in the Cold War context, not just the HUAC context where it's thinking about like, oh, who's going to stand when all your liberties are being eroded? Like, someone's got to stand up, and you can keep passing the buck, just like I think Sam does by hiding and telling his wife to say no one's here. But at some point, the bad guys are going to come, like whether this is fascism or commies or whatever, and you're going to have to stand up against them. And who's going to be the person who does that? It's got to be the person who very much that we'll see in like The Dark Knight, which is very much a disguised Western in its own way. We'll talk more about that with Shane. Is someone that a hero that we need, but not a hero we want. right? Someone that has to kind of go against these things in order to make it happen. That's where individualism versus collectivity comes in, because it's kind of saying, yeah, we need the individual man who will do violence, even if that individual man, in this case, is not a vigilante, but the marshal, the one we gave, who I guess technically Will Kane is still technically the marshal, but he kind of gave his badge up right before he left. So he's still kind of a vigilante. He's in this weird kind of space. That I think the inevitability of noon's going to come and what's going to happen then is a really interesting wake-up call to folks in this way.
Yeah, I think there's a fascinating logic that we tap into Kane and his reasoning for everything that he's doing here, as far as like his need to pick that badge back up and stay, his need to go ahead and fight, his logic or his reasoning, the fact that they're just going to chase us down, we're not even going to get to the next town if we go. Like there's a lot of I don't know, speculation on his part as to what's going to happen, and who knows, maybe it boils down to the fact that, you know, the view of the marshal is that it's my job to do this, and he just can't let that go, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, this ending is much more pessimistic to me than the gunfighter's ending, because the gunfighter ending is, I give this curse upon this guy who had it coming, and it's a curse unto all who kill innocent men. And the people around him, including the marshal, his friend, who says, like, I should arrest you or kill you right now, is saying, like, someone is going to hold the values of this individual who was a force of justice, or a reformed force of justice. Versus here, after everyone in the town has shown they're either too rational or too afraid to do what needs to be done, at least in this movie's logic, in order to commit violence or stand up and sacrifice their purity or their material possessions or their life in order to protect the world around them, no one is left who will do that. The people who did, right, who might have, Helen Ramirez, I'm sure she would have done something like that, but she's like, I'm out of here. Like, he's not my man. If I were my man, I'd be staying here, right? But the two people who would and show that they do, which is Will Kane and his wife, Amy, leave. So this is kind of saying, screw all of you. This town is dead, and this town and the way that it might as well be dead. This is kind of like saying, if the U.S. is going to fall into fascism, let them, right? I did my best. I'm gone, right? And this is the HUAC approach. Like, if you all are going to do the Red Scare, screw you, I'm gone. And that's basically what the writer does for a while. And then he ends up becoming, he does his own writing later on, but it really hurt his career to do that. And I think that dropping of the badge, some people have said stamped on it, but that's because we're in a time where they weren't able to watch it right after. There's fascinating time of film scholarship where people say these details that are flat out wrong because you have the DVD or you have the streaming service, but they get away with it because, like, hey, who's going to watch them? Happens a lot with philosophy folks, but you know, that's a little James Clavell thing. This was a fascinating part because it is more pessimistic because the idea is dead, not the person, not the individual, which is, I think, a really interesting way of approaching this and seeing it as different than some of the other Westerns we've seen.
Let's shift gears and talk about George Stevens' 1953 film Shane. This film represents a significant turning point in this genre's evolution as it begins to explore the mythic dimensions and psychological complexities of our Western hero. The story centers on the titular character, played by Alan Ladd, a mysterious gunslinger, or as you said, kind of the Dark Knight who strolls into town here, who becomes embroiled in a conflict between homesteaders and a ruthless cattle baron. As Shane navigates this struggle, he forges a deep bond with the Starrett family, particularly young Joey, who idolizes him as a heroic figure. This film kind of both embraces and subverts this mythic archetype, which I think is pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To go back to Bazan, he said that the super westerns are things that are not satisfied being themselves, and that's what the approach that we'll see with Johnny Guitar, but also with High Noon, were allegories for something else, right? Or like some sort of thing that they're pushing on. Versus Shane, he says, justifies the Western through the Western, right? It's like so Western, it becomes almost campy to a point. Like, as I said, mentioned earlier in one of the other talks, Shane comes from the far West, like just a little dot in the landscape, clad in buckskins. And we see little Joey, who better name than Bob, as it was in the book, looks at him through the framing of elk horns. So he's like part of the environment coming out. We have moments of like the two main characters are becoming are bonding through destroying a stump of a tree. Like, it is the most male bonding moment ever, and like this heroic sort of approach, which comes up a lot in Westerns, like ways of males showing affection. I think there's a really interesting relationship between Joe and Shane that's in here. This is very much pulling all of the Western tropes and kind of putting them to a higher register in its own way, or at least the gunslinger character as this sort of angelic figure who comes out of nowhere, is immediately good. No one questions that he's good. The only thing that Marion's worried is, you bring guns here, sir. Right? Like, I don't think this is good. We shouldn't have any guns in the valley. And that's something that when he's showing Joey, like, she's really worried about. And that makes sense. But I feel like this is a Western that feels very campy to some folks, especially to my students. But I love the heck out of it because I read it as a myth, right? I read it as this is what happens.
That's what I think is so interesting, because I can totally see that, especially because in many ways, I mean, you know, Shane is largely kind of the protagonist of the story, but we're watching him, like, the story is told from Joey's perspective. Like, we are with Joey and we're kind of exploring this myth through a child's eyes. And I think the idea of this story being kind of this tale about this mythic character makes sense in kind of the view of the fact that we're seeing it through a child's perspective. And I think that really taps into some element there that we haven't seen before, where we're really watching this story told by this child and his view on all of this, right up through the end as he watches Shane right away.
And he's the audience member too. So this kind of like, he is an audience surrogate as sort of things. We begin when he comes out, like Shane says, I like a man who sees what's going on. He is the viewer, literally the viewer this whole time. And he's the narrator in the book. So it kind of fits this way. But we see so many moments like when Joe and Shane go back into that bar after Shane has gone without violence, after being like, had splashes of soda and like he doesn't get splash soda on him, he keeps the soda. They get splashed him with alcohol, so and he walks out after Chris Calloway is like finding these sort of things. It's later on when he comes here and then starts a bar fight, and then Joe joins him, and that same music when they're chopping the log down comes in, which is like, this is this. We keep cutting back to Joey looking at this, and this is kind of looking at, I think it is a good place for people who loved Westerns as kids, seeing what this is and seeing like, this is what I liked as kids. As a kid, this is the hero doing their hero thing and being really cool as they do it. And there's a naivete to that we see through like Marion's approach, where she's like, I'm seeing what you're doing to Joey. I'm seeing that he wants to be like a gunfighter like you. He's going around with a toy gun saying bang, bang for no reason, which is not good in its own way. But is an approach. It is an approach that it feels like we're able to be a little self-reflexive about what audiences are, that we'll see later on, like the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance and Unforgiven and things like much later on, where we'll be questioning these. It does it in a much subtler way. And I think that like thinking of it as through the kid's eyes becomes a question of how much of this is the idealism of Westerns in general. Like, are Westerns childish? And at least for me, the reason I like Shane is because, he is not your guy who's really conflicted all that much. The most conflict he kind of has is like, should I let this guy go and deal, like, should I let Joe go and deal with his own battles, or should I fight for him? And there is definitely a tension between him and Marion and Joe as this kind of love triangle, because we see this in The Searchers too. But I think the most problem he has is just like, how do I do this without people getting hurt? He kind of knows his lot, and he knows what is going to happen, and he knows what happens when he goes into that thing in a way that feels kind of supernatural, like an angel would go and saying, I know this is the end. That I will leave you after this point. So I read him that way just because I feel as though that feels like the extent of what this movie is doing. It's talking about Shane is the West and the idea of the West. He is the exemplification of what a good man is to Joe Starrett. Joe says to Marion in this really powerful scene, like, I see the way you look at him. If I get through, it's great. But if you can't, I know that you're going to be taken care of. Pretty much giving permission and saying, as a man, I know I'm not everything you wanted. But for Marion, Shane is that life that she didn't have beyond the ranch, where she could go on these adventures and see this wide open place and just go and live. And for Joey, it is, this is who I want to be, because at the beginning, he shoots and he's cool. He's better than my dad, who he asks, could you beat up Shane, in a way that I think really fits with anyone who's been around a kid for too long. He represents this in a way that is very different. And I think that, like, seeing him as that imaginary friend character makes this less, as one of my students had put it, a cuck film, as they put. And I said, you're not wrong, but it is something that is interesting in this approach. And I think that, like, reading it allegorically is a way that has always been really rich to me. And I think I also just like the idea of our knight in shining armor, and my love for what these things are and what that means to look up to. Right. I see the fight that they have, and I think this is not stupid. It is stupid, but it's like, it's not something they need to do. They don't need to have this fight, but it is something that means something to see people who are bullies get their comeuppance. And that is the struggle that I think a lot of American men, especially growing up now, where we know that, hey, like, repressing your emotions, being violent is not a good thing, kind of have to deal with, like, well, what is the role of violence? What is the role of standing up to bullies? And how do you do that in a way that makes you strong and not toxic to everyone around you?
Yeah, right. I mean, it's an interesting psychology in there, in how Shane recognizes he needs to deal with these things, and how Joe, and I guess by extension the rest of the people of the valley, feel that they have to deal with things to the point where they're trying, but they don't have the strength, and they get run off or killed. And I think that's the this dark nature that we have here, because when you see, like, Elisha Cook Jr.'s character Stonewall, when he tries, they end up killing him. And they paint it in a way where it's like, well, yeah, you saw it. He drew on this guy. Like, we're looking at that world of law and lawlessness, and these are people who are willing to spin their own stories. I mean, there were no other witnesses, so they're going to just say whatever they want in order to make it sound like Stonewall was at fault, and that's the reason that he's dead. Yeah. And Joe and all of these other people in the valley want to try to live an honest life, create a good society, but they're bumping up against these people who fight, who enjoy that. I don't know if enjoy is the right word, but they use that world of lawlessness to their advantage to take what they want. That's how they've always done it. And in many ways, that's how the West was founded, right? People just taking what they wanted because, like, hey, this is a great patch of land. I'm going to kill whoever says it's theirs.
We saw that in Red River.
Yeah, we just talked about that. And Shane is that person who's tottering on both sides of that line, and recognizes those people and sees what the townsfolk want to create, and knows what he has to do by stepping back into that world in order to help them move forward. Yeah.
And to go that parallel, there's this great essay that talks about this being the idea of a disguised Western. Shane is the example for this film, which is, for this idea, which is that there is an outlaw hero and an official hero, right? The outlaw hero is cool and you want him to win, right? And you want him to do the cool thing and fire the guns and he's really competent. And then there's the official hero who is the marshal or the person who's attached to the society or the someone who's like, yeah, if this were a real world, you'd want him to win. And we're supposed to attach ourselves to him, but we usually approach ourselves to the outlaw hero. And you see this dynamic, at least the article presents it throughout classical Hollywood, whether it's in musicals with the person who's like a much cooler than the other person who's easy to settle down with, or as I use to my students, like this is Captain America and Iron Man, right? There is one who's like, this is the person that, yes, probably we should follow accords and we shouldn't have superheroes doing whatever they want willy-nilly because it kills people. But oh man, Captain America is like, I know what's right and you got to do what's right and you can't be held down. That's a very Western trope. So like this becomes where I see a lot of Westerns going on. And that's why I show Shane as well for that reason, because I like Joe. We've got to stick with Joe. But if this film, just like High Noon before, it talks about we need one character who's going to stand up to folks. This one's kind of like we need some other, almost like, again, supernatural force to come, and supernatural force will allow people to get their comeuppance. But Joe's the person who's like, let's rally everyone, let's be the collective, and Van Heflin just does such a great job for it too.
Yeah, he's perfect. Yeah, it's an interesting look at those two versions of the hero and seeing them here, and then seeing how that translates even later to something like Unforgiven, where you could say Clint Eastwood is trying to be the ideal hero, but has to finally, at the end, step back into his role of the other hero, you know, to clean things up. So,
or Logan, the film there is citing Shane all the time, right? It is not a Shane remake really, but there's No Guns in the Valley actually says that, right? So it's like it is a matter of thinking about how this myth continues with us through Hollywood filmmaking.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's take a short break and we will be right back. All right, our next stop in the post-war Western landscape is Nicholas Ray's 1954 film Johnny Guitar. This unconventional Western further pushes the boundary of the genre, delving into psychological depths and employing a heightened, almost operatic visual style. The story revolves around Vienna, played by Joan Crawford, a strong-willed saloon owner who faces opposition from the local community, led by the vengeful Emma Small, played by Mercedes McCambridge. Into this tense situation arrives Johnny Guitar Logan, played by Sterling Hayden, a former gunslinger and Vienna's ex-lover who becomes embroiled in the conflict. We're subverting traditional gender roles here and power dynamics within the Western genre. What does the film's approach, and especially how it's so stylized in its approach, reveal about kind of the psychological and the emotional undercurrents that we have in our story?
Yeah, my students love this one. I love this one too. This is, you said stylized. A lot of people have said campy, right? Which is,
It always comes as a term later, right? Like I think at the time it's stylized. Later we're saying, well, it's campy, but sure.
Yeah. People at the time were saying it was ridiculous, right? Like a lot of Americans did not like this movie, but it was like Europeans were like, Nicholas Ray knows what he's doing. And this is Republic Pictures. This was, one of the Poverty Row studios or minor studios, which was, Nicholas Ray was working in because he was kind of gray listed at this point. He wasn't quite flat out blacklisted, but he originally, there was a whole litmus test with the "I Married a Communist" script. I don't know if you know this story. It was sent around by Hughes, and anyone who said no to it they were saying was a communist, and there were two other people were blacklisted because of it. He initially said yes, and then he backed out, and then other people at the studio kind of vouched for him, but he was still in this gray line space. And especially like that, he wanted to kind of push against not only the Western itself, but like the idea of these people who are up in hysteria about like the Red Scare thing. So a lot of this is read through this lens. Sterling Hayden, who had a little bit of a guilt for turning in some of his friends, wanted to do this one because he kind of felt like it was coming back. Ward Bond, who was playing the mayor guy, thought who was very like conservative, thought he was playing somebody and not with the butt of a joke, but he's essentially the butt of a joke because like, oh, this big man is just following whatever Emma Small says, literally
right.
Emma Small, who is shown as this hysterical woman that's kind of like the idea of the people that are behind this. So yeah, pretty misogynistic way of approaching it. But people have read into this, especially with Joan Crawford, who's coming back from kind of a delay, especially after like falling after being a self-made star at MGM, then becoming Mildred Pierce in 1947, and then is still kind of this figure of dissatisfaction, jumps in here for this really diva-ish performance where she's very much against Mercedes McCambridge. Like they have like a lot of fight on set in ways that are not okay. But I know that Nicholas Ray was like, this is great. Like, put it into your acting. Who knows how well that worked out. But whatever the case, like this film is, for me, very much a super Western in the same way where it is not really satisfied being itself, but also gives a chance for Joan Crawford and Emma Small to really do these really interesting things with gender, this like masquerade approach that we don't see elsewhere. We see the Furies with Anthony Mann, who has a strong female character who takes over a ranch, and we will see later, we get some of that in 40 Guns and Big Country even. But Vienna is different. Like she is coming out wearing pants, and Eddie, her like roller, pretty much comes to the camera and says she's a woman that makes me feel less a man, right?
Yeah.
Which
and
is
I'm
like
kind of okay with it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost a broke. Yeah. It's I'm kind of okay with it. It's almost a breaking of the fourth wall until they cut and show that, oh, you're actually talking to Tom. It's a really interesting moment in the film. But she comes out and she's on top of this, like on top of her banister, and she says, "Spin the wheel, Eddie." And he's like, "But no one's here." So she spins the roulette wheel, and then she lets it keep spinning while the crowd comes in, and Emma Small says like all her things, and then she says, "Stop the wheel." She like controls the whole space and the sonic landscape. Using this for sound is a great one, but she is very aware of her presence, like walking down the stairs and like turning her gun on folks. She also dresses in different things to convey different approaches, right? Like there's so many costume changes that are just wild in this movie. Like she, when she knows the people are coming in to burn her place, essentially, she's in this pure white dress, playing piano, again, controlling the sound. And then when she's going, that burns a little bit. And then so she has to change into a different pair of clothes. And then she leaves. And then when she gets to the hideout, she changes again to the like yellow and red ensemble. That's like the very bright thing we see at the end. And it was just bizarre, but it's very much because she is, as a character, using aspects of her gender and femininity to kind of play a ruse of like trying to fit into one side or the other as it suits her. And this is why it's been read as well as its campiness later, as very much a like a queer-coded film, or one that is approaching some really interesting like feminist angles to it. Even if some of the reasons for it seem to be the butt of a joke originally for Nicholas Ray, having Joan Crawford as Vienna really makes this really cool, I think.
Yeah, and with Mercedes McCambridge across from her, like so fiery and just explosive the way that she is performing. I mean, it is never a small performance that she gives.
Oh no,
she's always
very much like Wicked Witch of the West when she's like turning after that fire. She's like, and you're like, oh okay.
I know she's eating it all up, and and again, as you said, Wicked Witch of the West. I mean, she's very much here doing a witch hunt. Like it very much is a story about. I mean, this is very much maybe the most overt of our stories that's dealing with kind of HUAC and communism and everything. It's right on the label, but there still is so much going on, and the gender dynamics I found so fascinating watching this. The way that. The way that Johnny Guitar, our title character, and it's and to the point, like the film is called Johnny Guitar. It's named after him, yet he is here to kind of work for her. Yeah. But then as it turns out, kind of like help her in this journey that they end up having as she's mistaken for having been involved in this robbery. And as they get kind of enmeshed in all of that and trapped in this gorgeous Sedona, I will just say.
Yeah.
I love that they filmed all of this up in the Red
Mm-hmm.
Rock area of Sedona. It's just
Beautiful.
so beautiful. But like, this is a man who is like, he's always like, there is a romantic angle between the two,
Yeah.
but at the same time, it always seems like he's just here because he wants to support her, and it feels very much more about her place than his. And I
Yeah.
found that so interesting. The film is called Johnny Guitar, but really, he's only here to help her, and
Yeah.
it was a surprise to see that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I feel like it's especially because they made that such a great song there. This is one of those films, just like High Noon and 310 to Yuma, that my partner hates when I've watched because I'm always singing or humming the like theme songs, which are really cool. Like, bring those back.
Nothing like singing a song about Frank Ringa or Frank Miller being dead.
Frank Miller.
Like,
I gotta shoot Frank Miller dead. Like, why? Like, I don't need it. Do not forsake me, oh my darling. And she definitely does. In those cases. But no, whatever the case, I think that the bit about making it Vienna rather than Johnny Guitar is interesting in that sense, though her bar is Vienna's, and that is the main thing that gets lost anyway. One of the things I like about this movie is how it shows the approach to language and gender. Jane Tompkins I guess it's Women in the Language of Men. She's talking about this in her larger book on Westerns. Writes a chapter about how men in Westerns are supposed to be stoic and quiet, like the world around them, become part of the Monument Valley, essentially. And women have this, are very much associated with words versus action. This puts that into a lot of different cases, because Vienna is very good with her words and also good with action. And Emma Small is pretty much the same thing. She's like the one who's going to kill these things. And so the men in response seem kind of silly or like unable to use words. And we get this really cool scene with Sterling Hayden as Johnny Guitar saying, "Lie to me, Vienna. Like, tell me it wasn't like that you loved me and you weren't with any other men," where she obviously was. And she says, "I love you. I wasn't with any other men." And like, tell me these things. And he tries to tell a story about like, it's like this whole thing is different, right? Remember, all that past hasn't happened. We've just walked right here. And he seems like almost desperate, very desperate in this case, because he as a man does not have control over language. In fact, he's like, "I don't want you to tell me." And she's like, "I've got to tell you, and I'm going to tell you because I want to tell you," in a way that's like this power that we see in things like Red River, where it's just like, or other ones where it's like, "Shut up, I'm going to do my thing," or even as Johnny says, "What does a man need except for a smoke and a cup of coffee?" Right? Like, there's those little aphorisms that come everywhere, become so impotent against like, I have an emotional thing and I can't explain it, and I want to tell you, but you have control over these words in a way that is that men just do not have access to, is really interesting in a film like this.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating film. Absolutely an interesting step forward as we're talking about all this. Let's move to John Ford's 1956 epic, The Searchers. And, we haven't really called it out, but we loosely have. We should just say this was a hard choice. We decided we're going to do one film per director.
Yep.
And so, John Ford had many options. Howard Hawks, Anthony Mann, so many options. This is where we landed with John Ford. Yeah. This film represents a searing exploration of the Western hero's darkest impulses and the genre's deeply rooted themes of racism, obsession, and the search for identity. The story follows Ethan Edwards, played by John Wayne, a Civil War veteran who embarks on a years-long quest to find his niece, Debbie, played by Natalie Wood, after she's abducted by Comanche raiders. As Ethan's journey progresses, his obsession takes on increasingly disturbing dimensions, revealing the deeply ingrained racism and psychological trauma that drives his actions. As I watched this, and then I was reading some comments that people had written on Letterboxd, it made me wonder, is this film... I mean, lots of people love this film. Many people tout this film for many reasons. But I was wondering, is this film perhaps like an example of like the most post-war Western where you really it helps to actually understand what post-war Westerns are, to actually understand what they're doing in this film? because some people watch it and they're like, I hate this guy. Like, why should I be interested in following this person?
Yeah. See, that's a good point, and that's why I had it on my syllabus the first time I ran it, and then I took it off, and then I for a little bit, and then I put it back on this time, because it is a film that is definitely, I think it's Ford very much wrestling with these issues, especially of colonialism and racism, in a way that doesn't always work, right? Like he'll be dealing with things about race and the legacies of colonialism throughout the rest of his filmography. Like we talk about Sergeant Rutledge, which is really interesting with Woody Strode, which comes out in the 60s. But here it is definitely pulling from this idea of kind of like what Red River is showing. John Wayne is kind of this imperialist who's just like, I don't care that there are Native Americans here. I don't care that this person's here.
Yeah.
And problematizing it. This is showing John Wayne as a genocidal maniac, right? And I say that specifically because like genocide is killing on top of these other things. We see him shooting out the eyes of a Native American that is, you can clearly see his breathing when they take the thing off, which is really hilarious. And actually probably something where it's like, hey, we're still here and alive. I know they call us Comanche, but we're the Dene, the Navajo. At least I believe that actor was Dene.
Pretty sure.
He shoots out the eyes there. He goes to kill buffalo, and he says like, "Wait, we got what we wanted." It's like, no, we got to kill them because it will starve them essentially. And he at the end, which for everybody was like, it's going to be a tension whether he's actually going to kill Debbie because she's been touched by someone. Like miscegenation was being talked about around this time. There's a lot of things that are dealing on here. So to like John Wayne, who again people have grown up with and very much like throughout the other movies, is to say I'm okay with him being literally genocidal, right? In this own way. I think that like there are a lot of subtleties in this sort of case where it's a matter of like, but you know, Confederacy, how does this all approach? And is the film still saying it's still okay, he's cool, this is just like the edgy version we get for now, which I think a lot of people can walk away reading, right? But there is a fact that he doesn't get to kill Scar. He just like scalps him at the end. And he does have these moments of like, he's very much against Marty at the beginning, but then by the end is kind of like, is kind of okay with him because in the same way that like his character in Red River is okay with Matt, is just like, you're my son, I guess now, which is really weird. But there's so many moments in this movie because this is a long movie and really bloated to the point it doesn't need to be. There's like the whole like going back and forth. They spend years going. There's the whole plot with the fiance who
the comedy side of the story.
Which is hilarious and I love, but it is two different movies, right? That are kind of approaching in this way. And I think that's also kind of because Ford is still trying to figure out what he's trying to say with this. And I think the biggest part comes in with Bella Archuleta, who is playing Look, the person that Marty accidentally marries, the Comanche woman, an indigenous woman. And there's a point where she tries to crawl in bed with her husband, and he kicks her out of the bed and she rolls down a hill, and we see John Wayne laughing and saying that's a cause for divorce in Texas, which is like, okay, it is a racist joke, colonialism joke. It is a wife beating joke. It's like so dark, and we don't see her hit the ground in the same way that like, the reason cartoon characters is okay to smash them with an anvil is because we don't see them suffer afterwards. We see them pop back up. We don't actually see her reverse shot where she looks back. We just see her running back down. And then she gets killed later on, and we're supposed to feel sympathy for her. So I think it is very much Ford trying to figure out, how do I deal with this thing? Like, is it funny that this person there's like a problem here and like a sexuality thing here that is off, or is it not? Are we supposed to like Wayne, or are we not? I think there's a lot of weirdness there that my own thought is that I don't think Ford completely worked out with this film, which is why it is so weird tonally and off the charts in that regard. At least watching it now, which is one of the reasons I'm fascinated by it. Right? It is definitely something to be thinking about, especially considering the fact that John Wayne himself has said, like, I'm when he was asked once in the 70s, I think, or later in his life, about what if he's a white supremacist, he said, like, I'm a white supremacist until we can get black people in a good place, which is very bad. So it's like,
geez.
very clearly this
Yeah.
is a thing of looking at our heritage and questioning this. But as some of my students said, like, yeah, the other characters, the other Westerners that we're looking up to probably were like this too. We just didn't have to look at it before, right?
Yeah.
So really, he is the ultimate Westerner. He is Johnny Ringo, or even the other ones we've looked at here. Like, he is maybe not Gary Cooper, but definitely Lynn McAdam. He is the Indian killer, quote unquote, archetype that we just kind of brushed over. And I think we see this in this film too, because there are so many moments where not just Scar, who again, red face sort of thing, but we see in the sides when the cavalry is coming through or the posse is coming through, we see women and children of the Comanche running away. We see them being rounded up by the cavalry and marched through these things, along with the white women that we see are like completely crazy because I guess they spent time with there. There's a lot of things where we're seeing in the margins of this film, what's going on is not good, but it's not really looked at in the exact same way as it would be later on in revisionist Westerns in the 60s and such.
And you mentioned earlier in our conversation that, like, this was something that had happened. This is, very loosely based on some historical stories of white women who had been taken and married to somebody in a tribe and
captivity narratives.
And so that's very much a historical thing. I think you're right. I think that John Ford is struggling with his views on all of this. I mean, we know historically he was in love with Monument Valley. He films the story that takes place in Texas in Monument Valley, which look nothing like each other. He was very much a part of kind of the Dene tribe up there. Like, very, very friendly with them and made kind of like this lifelong bond with them, and uses a number of them here in the film. But at the same time, I think he's trying to figure out how to tell a story like this. I just don't know if it's as successful as many people feel. I think there are elements that I generally always struggle with, but it is nice to see that, I think where this film succeeds is how unflinching he is in so many of the elements of the portrayal of Ethan throughout the film. Like, it is a rough film for John Wayne, like, for the character. Like, for him, it's like you don't see your hero, your movie star actors wanting to sign up for dark characters like this. It's a tricky thing to do because it can make people look at you in a different way. And it's so kudos for him to be in it, because I think he is doing something different that's much darker. Even if at the time when it came out, I don't know if many people necessarily noticed all of that, and they just said, "Oh, John Wayne, he's out there killing Injuns again," and just like just the way that awful way that people would view all of this.
Yeah, I mean there's other things. I mean, like, I have to start my course too with folks like I know what it looks like to have me, a straight white man, saying, I'm going to teach a course about the Western. But knowing that, like, we start with the, as I said, the Lakota grass dance, which was hailed by people, or one person saying that the camera was more effective at killing Indians than the machine gun, which is really showing like, oh, we're just putting them in this thing and they're literally in a black box, the black box Maria, and saying, that is the past, or that is them, and that is who we put them in. And which is an opposition, especially by the time we get to the 30s and the late 30s and into the 40s and 50s, to the original idea of, or a lot of the earlier Westerns, or things we call Westerns, which are hiring Native American actors, or showing them in really interesting ways, or like showing them in ways that, yeah, still cringeworthy. The Indian princess approach, which we'll get in different things, like even in something like Broken Arrow from 1950, where Delmer Dave's trying to do a more fitting an interesting approach to this to Native Americans in that film. There's still a lot of there was a fascination with, and not always positive fascination with, but a lot of agency given to Native American actors and characters in earlier versions of the Western, especially during the silent epics, right? The invaders is, you don't actually hear who the invaders are, whether the white people coming in or the people, I think, or the tribe people there that are attacking. I'm trying to remember the name of the actual people in this film.
Yeah,
it escapes me. But it is one that's purposefully vague, because they show over and over again this this image, like on a silent film, they show the image of, here is what you wrote, they will not come into our lands, and we signed this, and then they show it ripping it up. They show that like 4 times in the film, so that people know this was a betrayal, right? These are people too, which is really interesting to see as we go forward. That becomes less convenient, especially in the Cold War era, where we're trying to say, this is who we are, we're the good guys, or if we are the bad guys, we were the bad guys then, sort of approach, which is not really, or is glazing over all of the very real racial injustices at the time, and continuing on past that time. That were going on. So this film is really interesting to me because, unlike something like Dances with Wolves, which is very white savior narrative and trying to like gussy it up in a very way that kind of pulls agency away in these approaches, it is very conflicted in the way it even wants to approach things. Well, at least that's what I see when I watch this film. So that was what makes it interesting to me, in its own sense. Though as I tell my students, like, I would hesitate to say that this is my favorite film for any reason in particular, especially as a first way of, this is what I know it at you. And honestly, I like some other films on this list better, including the next one we're going to be talking about.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the next one, let's talk about Delmer Dave's 1957 film 3:10 to Yuma. This tightly crafted psychological drama explores the themes of moral courage and the blurred lines between hero and villain, set against the backdrop of a tense hostage situation. The story follows Dan Evans, played perfectly by Van Heflin, a struggling rancher who agrees to escort notorious outlaw Ben Wade, played by Glenn Ford, to the titular train, facing both external threats and internal doubts along the way. As the two men engage in a psychological battle of wits, the film delves into the complexities of their respective moral codes and the nature of heroism in the face of adversity. I love the moral gray area here we have with hero and villain. What is this film's kind of like this intensity that they have with the psychological focus here reveal about how this genre is kind of continuing to evolve through the 50s?
Yeah. I love this movie. Thank you for letting me revisit it. I had kept it off of my syllabus for a while, but mainly because it's so close to High Noon, and I was doing things with like context at the time as far as its structure. And people have said this too. It's very close to this, but I like it better in some ways. This kind of goes back to when I talked about the Treasure of the Sierra Madre. I talked about the Westerner and gangster dynamic, where we had Dobbs as this gangster who was money driven and ambitious and ended up dying because of his ambition and his desire after that, versus the Westerner who was Curtin, who is more like, all he wants to do is go back to picking fruit, right? And like just having his own little orchard maybe one day, which is the man of leisure. This kind of flips it in an interesting way. Ben Wade, who is seeing we are seeing holding up a stagecoach and getting a bunch of money, and we see him offering a lot of like ludicrous amounts of money throughout the film. Is actually seems to be enjoying what he's doing and spending time with the women in the film, like Emmy, and like actually caring about these things in a way that's like he's literally lounging most of the film. Versus Van Heflin's character Dan, who is your working rancher guy who you think is kind of the thing, but he is driven by wanting success and wanting to prove he is a man and wanting money. that's what he is driven by in this film originally. And he ends up changing that. But we get this Westerner gangster dynamic that is applied to the person who is essentially, this is a sequel to Shane. It's essentially Van Heflin's character again, in like later on in his life, versus, except I would say he's Van Heflin's character if he wasn't able to say, you know what, I know that I'm not good enough for you, Marion, and I'm okay with that, which is a really cool thing to do as far as like masculinity goes. And one who is saddled with a wife and kids who both want to look up to him, want him to be a Shane, and he's like, I want to just like own this thing, but also like I'm not going to get myself killed for it, in a really interesting way. So like this is a film that, with the dynamic between the two characters and the idea of what it actually takes to make money in the West, and the realities of what happens in a drought, is I think one of the most interesting things about this, and the thing that actually puts him as a character, not just an archetype, but as someone who has something to lose and is actually wants to stand for, this is what the masculine thing to do, don't let this guy go, right? Don't fall into moneyed interests. And yet he gets rewarded for it at the end too, which is very different than in 2007 when they remade this with Russell Crowe, which is like, he's going to die because of the way he is. And that's a heroic sacrifice. But here it's like not a heroic sacrifice. He just like charms the charmer into letting him do his thing because of his pure tenacity, which I think is one of the most like Western things out there.
It's such an interesting view of the hero, really. I mean, he's, in many ways, he is kind of just upholding his principles, and he's standing by through thick and thin. I mean, in many ways, you're right. I can see the comparison with High Noon. Every other person bails on him, to the point where the stagecoach owner is just like, you know what? I'll still give you your money. It's not worth it. Let's just let him go and just move on and not worry about it anymore. And I mean, even nowadays, like you hear. Like people who are working at banks, they're told if there's a robbery, just let them take the money because
don't be a hero.
Insurance, don't be a hero. Insurance will cover it. And like that, it's such an interesting mindset shift in how we view all of this, and kind of like the complexities of how difficult it is to do what's right. And here he is, like, he has the money, like he ostensibly, like the stagecoach guy says, here, I'll pay you. You don't have to do this. And that's all he needs. And so and then we get to the end of the film and it starts raining, and it is a little bit of like the story of Job. Like, would it have rained had he taken the money and let Wade go? Who knows? But it's one of those sorts of things that I think it plays in an interesting way.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I think he is, to compare it to High Noon, like High Noon is very much doing this in an allegorical way, right? Every character stands in for someone else too, right? Like the people who are in the church is like the church and state saying, hey, we shouldn't have this violence either unless it benefits us. So like, thank you for your service, but gone. Then there's people who are like the bleeding heart liberals, essentially. It was like, you should not do this, or like you should not die, or these sort of things, or like our family and friends. But here it is interesting that it feels like each of these characters don't really stand in for others, right? There are more of individuals in their own way. Like the banker, for example. If we were reading this, then it is kind of like moneyed interests take you into this. But he's the last guy standing, not because the drunkard, the other guy who's just like, I just want to prove myself, man, who is kind of a foil for Dan, who's Dan's like, am I just this drunkard who has no business being here? But then he like immediately or almost immediately changes his tune and says, yeah, this guy's a like ride or die guy. He's maybe a little bit like he has some troubles he's working on, but he puts it together to fight for this. So he's someone to look up to too. And the bank owner is the guy who brings all of the other posse together, and at the end says, jig is up, game is over, I will give you the $200, you don't have to do it, right? Which I think is like more of an individual choice for him. And if it was standing in for banks, it's like, what does that actually even stand for? It feels as though this is less valuable as an allegorical reading and more as either like a character study of like, what do you do in these particular things, but also going back to what the Western's all about, which is these questions of what is the role when rubber hits the road, when the idealism and practicality fit. You should, and like it rewards you for going with idealism, because the idealist approach here and like the moral I will stand for approach here is what gets him through. Because he just charms this guy who eventually says like, this is all a game for Wade too, by the way. Like he's a very cool protagonist, not only because he's so likable, but because he is, he's one step ahead of everything. He is a schemer we don't really see outside of like Moriarty or this sort of things, where it's like, I've outgunned you, I've outplanned you, like, and everything. And even at the end, he's like, yeah, I'll kick out of this thing, but now I know I'm not going to touch you, right? Yeah. Like, and that's the thing too. Like, if, and I don't think he should have done this, but if we had seen what happened with Frank Miller and in High Noon, and they had somehow got a version of respect between them, then when he broke out, he wouldn't come looking for him, right? Yeah, but here it is like male bonding beats even the archetypes in this role, which is really fascinating to me. And you know, Glenn Ford's Ben Wade is just so very nice as an actor, and so very charismatic. And there's so much here that's like, oh yeah, I guess we are in 1957. He literally just charmed her, had sex with her, and now is gone. Like we saw that on screen. It's one of those interesting things.
Yeah, slipping right out. Yeah. And she, you know, as he's getting taken away by the sheriff, she goes in and says her goodbyes. So yeah, it's not a love him and leave him sort of thing. There's definitely still the attraction there. So.
And it's cool too that she comes in and says, "Hey, I'm sorry for doing like the complicity with toxic masculinity," where it comes into like, this is something that a lot of people miss when we're talking about masculinity, femininity, how this works, is that in this film, it shows that she, kind of like Marion, but more explicitly, is like, I would also like you to be a big man too. And then she comes in and apologizes for that and says, hey, that was wrong. I'm sorry I made you feel that way. I just want you, which is the very positive, like, this is the sort of femininity that we need to get through, like the toxic, like the crisis of toxic masculinity is the sort of thing of like, I'm sorry I made you feel that you're less of a man. I love you and I just want you to stay here. And he then stays for different reasons, because that is just like the $200, right? That is his wife saying, you've done enough. It's really cool. And he says, it'll be a good story for the boys, but there's more to it at that point too. It's now it's between me and Wade. Now it's like who I've come to have this relationship with and like save him. Now it is interesting to like, this is for me too, right? Like,
he has to prove it to himself.
It is, I want to be a man for me, not for other people, which I think is a really interesting way of approaching masculinity that we don't even see in some of the other ones.
Well, although we'll certainly be able to talk about that same point in The Big Country, because that's a key part.
Oh, absolutely. That's why I like that one too.
Yeah. Let's move to Samuel Fuller's 1957 film 40 Guns. This audacious, stylistically innovative Western pushes the genre's boundaries with its subversive themes, strong female characters, and experimental visual approach. The story revolves around Griff Bennell, played by Barry Sullivan, a reformed gunslinger turned U.S. Marshal who arrives in Tombstone, Arizona with his brothers to arrest a local landowner. The situation is complicated by the presence of Jessica Drummond, Barbara Stanwyck, a powerful rancher who commands a loyal band of 40 gunmen, or close to. I'm not quite sure it ever quite gets there, but and shares a complex history with Griff. We're subverting Western tropes and gender roles here. Samuel Fuller is definitely one for kind of stylistic experimentation in his storytelling. What's he bringing to kind of this continuing evolution of the post-war Western here?
See, one of the things that I see here, I compare it a lot to The Furies, Anthony Mann's The Furies from 1950, which has Walter Houston as a great, like, very charismatic ranch kind of owner. But this one, she is Barbara Stanwyck, the lamp owner. Samuel Fuller is known for like pushing boundaries and being a little controversial in a lot of things. We see this here where he's very much doing things over the top. Like, it's less campy than Johnny Guitar. I don't know why they get away with, oh no, a tornado, and now we're in love. but they do in a way that I think like it didn't quite work in Johnny Guitar, even though that has a bunch of explosions on the
Right.
things.
Yeah.
But like the shows of power, like when she's at that long table, the dining table, and has all the 40 men, and then she says, "Could you leave us for a moment in a quiet voice?" and everyone gets up and goes.
Yeah.
Is interesting in that way. But then like Samuel Fuller also is much more sexually explicit in a lot of this stuff. There's a mention of, or at least a high implication of a rape, or someone trying to rape someone in the barn, and like in her youth. But also there's this whole back and forth where it's like, "I'm here to see your gun. May I feel it?" Just as like, "Why? Just curious." And he says, "May go off in your face." It's like, this is very much like beyond like a lot of the innuendo we've had before. And I think that is really interesting in this approach. That said, this film could have ended as it does, because he goes through this whole thing. He's kind of taking revenge for his brother, who was engaged to and about to marry the gunsmith's daughter, which is really cool. They have that big shot where it's like through the thing of the gun and looking at her, which is wonderful. But he goes and he kills the antagonist by shooting through his Barbara Stanwyck, Jessica Drummond's body. Right. And then it could have ended there, where like, well, that's it. Now I go off into the sunset. Like, that's the end. But they had to add that she starts running back in a wedding dress, essentially saying, "I love you and I forgive you." And they get in the coach together and leave, which was also showing, I think, towards the end of the 50s, the refusal to kind of leave those tropes behind completely for the more cynical stuff. Like, we're not all ending like High Noon, right? Or like The Searchers, which is like, "I will leave you now," and it's not really as a he's off to his next adventure. It's more like a, okay, well, now what sort of aspect. But here it is more tightly put together in a way that I'm like, oh, well, that kind of feels unfair now to the person who lost his real love, right? Versus this whole power play with this. But it's really interesting to see that mix of something that's very controversial and different, and also kind of sticks that landing kind of because it has to. It feels like, just like Johnny Guitar ends for no reason. They come out of the thing, no one's attacking them, and then they embrace. They don't need to embrace, right? There's no reason there, but they just kind of have it. It's really interesting approach.
Yeah, there's an element to the way that their relationship is portrayed over the course of the story, because I mean, you get this sense that there was this history that they had shared. They are reconnected because of the tornado and everything, and drawn back together in that whirlwind of passion that we have there. And but even in there, like, there's a shot when they're laying down together, and I can't remember, it's like the way that it was like his arm was around her neck, or his hand was on her neck or something, and it just, like, all of it seemed like there's this physical, like, there's violent sense to the love that they have, right?
Yeah.
And that just seems to be part of what Fuller is exploring here, and it's like, even in their relationship, and like the end of it ends, I mean, there's that violent moment in their relationship where he shoots her so that he can get the bad guy, which I don't know if we said, but is her brother, and so is also creating some other complicated feelings, I'm sure. And then to have her kind of throw all of that away and just run off with him, I think is such a it felt subversive to have her do that in a world where she's commanding these 40 guns. Why is this the moment that she's gonna change gears?
Yeah, I mean, like, until that point, until a couple other points in the movie, it could be very well read as she is manipulating him into doing what she wants. She wants him to be the sheriff because the sheriff, like, just has a big crush on her and is kind of annoying to her, but also, like, ends up overstepping his boundaries, and that's why everything goes to crap, is because he's, like, messing up the good plan that they had. There is a world in which she is trying to manipulate or, like, control him in that way, and I feel like at the very end, unlike Vienna, who like the ending for Vienna, where it's just like they're under the waterfall and then they hug and kiss, and I guess they're going off somewhere else, doesn't feel like it undermines her power, because literally there's just a moment ago where all the other men are just like, nope, not our fight, and she's still kind of controlling this area, even though she has no more fire here. The fact that she comes out in essentially a wedding dress and runs after him, and saying like, wait, stop, for him, versus like coming out on her horse and stopping him with 40 guns and then saying like, okay, I'm going with you, right? Kind of reduces her agency in a way that I didn't really like at the end. But hey, I'm not a director. I couldn't shoot one of these at all. It just does show that there is still questions about, just like this has to have a kind of happy ending, it's also a question of what do we do with the women of the West, in that this is why I had mentioned before the prostitute character is usually read as a companion for the man, is because they are masculine in a way that other feminine can't be. And they are, if we're looking at the binary of the East and the West, or civilization and wilderness, they are that figure in between. They're not the school marm, right? They are that figure who is between and is closer towards the wilderness side, which means that they can really draw blows with, or like go blow for blow with somebody else, versus the like rancher's daughter, who we'll see in Big Country, who kind of turns out not to be that sort of way, versus the entrepreneur like Vienna or Jessica here, that is also a different approach. So there's some weird things they're trying to figure out what to do with gender and how gender kind of fits, but we're still in the classical Hollywood paradigm of like, they either have to be like tragically killed or made into a widow, or not, right? Like, it's cool to be a tomboy, but there's only so much you can do in a film like this, which is kind of showing the limitations of the time too.
Yeah. How are you in time? Just pausing real quick.
I'm good on time. I know we have a little bit more time. I think I have until I have until 3:30 my time, so I have an hour and a half if we need to. But I know we've been talking a lot, so.
No, well, hey, I don't want to cut any movies if we don't have to. So if we want to keep talking,
let's keep going.
So all right. Let's journey to the Big Country. William Wyler's 1958 epic. This sweeping, thoughtful Western explores the themes of moral responsibility, the nature of masculinity, and the search for a more civilized frontier in the face of entrenched violence and prejudice. The story follows James McKay, played by Gregory Peck, sans mustache, an ex-sea captain who arrives in the American West to marry Patricia Terrell, played by Carol Baker, the daughter of a wealthy rancher. McKay soon finds himself embroiled in a bitter feud between his fiance's family and a rival clan led by the fierce Rufus Hannessy, the very bushy Burl Ives. As tensions escalate, McKay must navigate the complexities of frontier justice and assert his own moral code in a world steeped in violence and machismo. Not having seen this film before, I just really loved it. We're really kind of exploring the traditional notions of masculinity in the Westerns, and as that shifts into society, as well as the use of violence as a means of conflict resolution. And it's all told on this epic scope. What does that say about kind of like this evolving nature, and as we're looking at kind of the moral complexity with this film?
Yeah, I really like this film too, and I think epic is a good way of putting it. I mean, it's very long, but there are Western epics that people have tried and used, and that's one that kind of lends itself to epic. But they're of course in the 50s and trying to bring people into the theaters. What are you going to do? Get these beautiful cinematography, beautiful color, big actors, big scenes, and bring everyone together. Which is interesting for this because, there's the big fight at the end that's like kind of a large thing, but it's not like Charlton Heston's like the Ten Commandments or anything like that, where it's an epic in its own way. But it does feel like, to me, kind of a reversal in some ways of Red River, in Red River being kind of an epic that is taking all these things, because that is about a rancher who is is kind of a king and then becomes this Ahab-like figure, which is interesting because our character here is a captain, but is not Ahab-ish at all. And is in that film, it is about how one can deal with power and deal with power in a particular way. And I think this is interested in power, but it's interested in what that power is towards, right? I think like James McKay, so Gregory Peck's character, is very much an Eastern. It's set up to him being an Easterner who comes to the West, doesn't know what he's doing, and either eventually becomes part of the West and like kowtows to the law of the West, or is kind of like this greenhorn who needs to learn. Right? So many people try and fit him into that spot with like Old Thunder, when Steve, who's just like, yeah, you've got to ride Old Thunder, and he's like, I won't. Thank you very much. Or like, what do you know about ranching? And he's trying to say like, I don't know anything about ranching, but that's fine. And what do you know about being a man? Like Western masculinity, you're all from the East. And he doesn't actually lose his identity going West, as so many others do, right? Like one that I come to mind, like way back when, Buster Keaton's Go West. The whole joke is like he is an Easterner who doesn't know what to do, and he goes and he just kind of like pretends to be a Westerner, but like there's like scenes where he's walking like a cowboy, and tries to doesn't want to brand his poor cow, which is the love interest of the film. It's a whole thing. So he like shaves a little thing into it and says it's fine, right? And so like there's a kind of a humor of this Easterner becoming this, and we also see this with younger characters like Matt or Marty from the other films we've looked at before, who are learning to be a man in the West by, starting as a kid and going here. But he refuses to do that. He becomes someone who is like, I'm going to do this my way. And my way is bringing the East to the West, which is, I am not going to show off for this guy. I'm not going to go through the hazing. I'm going to go learn it myself. And the only person that's going to watch me, Alfonso Bedoya, who is, Gold Hat from back in Treasure of the Sierra Madre, is going to be sworn to secrecy. I'm not going to fight this guy in front of everybody. I'm going to go out, have a long fight, which is only like a 5-minute fight scene, but because the cinematography is such where they're like so small at certain points and things like that, they are just fighting until he's like, now what have we learned? And then he walks away. Like that is a really key thing. And like, I'm not even going to tell my fiance I'm buying this ranch. And the reason I'm buying this ranch isn't because I'm like the Red River guy. I'm buying this ranch because like, look, I have some capital. You don't want to run this all by yourself anymore, Julie, who I definitely am not going to end up marrying, which is an interesting sort of thing. I'm going to do this so that I can be the arbiter between both. I'm not going to make this part of the empire of my fiance. I'm going to make this my own thing, is very much showing this independence and not losing yourself, that is even kind of pushed against in when we began the Frederick Jackson Turner's idea of what makes an American American is they took the germ of Europe and they were in the wilderness and that became something new. Here, it's not that he doesn't change, but it is very much that he's like, I am staying myself and I'm doing it myself, which is a really interesting and refreshing way of, I think, approaching the West, because it shows that you can still be part of this thing and kind of fit it to your own mode of what is good and what makes a good man and what makes violence worth it, in a way that I think is really really powerful to see at the end of this period.
Well, and I think what we're getting, as we've been walking through the 1950s and walking through the evolution of the post-war Western and the different elements and how it's changed, I feel like we've left those violent needs that Jimmy Stewart has in Winchester 73 of I have to do whatever I can to go get my brother, or Ethan in The Searchers and his years-long pursuit to save Debbie from the Comanche. Here it's this moral reassessment that we've come to, and it's this place that's very very much we've kind of left those days behind, and now it's almost a little more we're out here. It's almost like this existential reflection of who am I in this new place, and he's not somebody who's going to change, and I think that's so interesting in again the evolution of society that we've kind of talked about in some of our earlier films, that this is a person who recognizes we can't just follow. I can't just succumb to all of what these people are wanting. I need to hold true, and society will kind of meet me there. And I think that's kind of like that moral code that he's demonstrating is part of that societal evolution that we're going to witness over time.
And the fact that he is, it's not just the world of the film is something that is more positive masculinity than like anything else. Like, it's not a world in which this is just normal. It is a world in which he is pushing against this on all fronts, right? He's pushing against the Steve Leach, Charleston Heston's Steve Leach, who is very much trying to emasculate him. He's pushing against his own wife, Patricia Terrell, who kind of had a thing with Steve at one point, and also is trying to emasculate him. He's pushing against the understanding of even like Ramon, who is like, why are you on Old Thunder anyway? He doesn't like end up, as I might expect, like he owns Old Thunder and now he uses it everywhere.
I know,
right?
I was kind of expecting that.
No.
I'm like, what is he going to come riding out on the horse?
Yeah, but to do that would be to say like, oh, the reason he was doing that is so he could get power, right? But that's not what he's about, right? And I thought originally he was being secretive about it so he could like impress people later the first time I saw it. So it's like, oh, he can trick them, which is something that you would expect from a John Wayne character or any of James Stewart's characters in the cycle from Man, where we just like trick the folks into there. But no, he does it for himself and no one else. And like the fact that he's able to stick to it is, I think, really cool. There are people who, when I was looking at the reception of this film, Variety had written like it was too long, and it kind of proves that though peace is a pious precept, fighting's more exciting because it ends with this big fight scene about this thing. But like that fight scene, it also is kind of earned, I think, in its own way, but it is showing the kind of stupidity, but also the acceptance of the two major characters, like Henry Terrell and Rufus Hannessy, as accepting that this is the end, right, for them, right? Like we saw Gregory Peck's character does this whole thing where he's like, I'm not going to shoot on your boy. I'm not going to do it. And he shows himself to be more of a man than the boy who is literally like running and trying to hide behind a wagon wheel, and that his dad has to kill. But his dad has to kill him in a way that I think at this point for me, like Rufus kind of realizes this is stupid, right? Like this is as far as this masculinity goes. This is as far as this feud can go. So now we just got to fight it out. And the fact they both die is kind of accepting this is the end of the old way, just like we were saying before, fathers and sons, and more towards there can be a world of the new, which is where we see at the end where James and Julie are riding off into what is now going to be their ranch. It's not clear that it's going to be the case, but also like it's not the same. We don't leave with the moral clarity. We leave with a moral clarity that we don't at the end of something like even if the original Stagecoach, where it's like they go off into Mexico into the next thing and they're going to be living happily ever after. But we also know that realistically, because we know these characters, that ranch and this area is now healed. And this is kind of a positive civilization thing versus going all the way back to Stagecoach in 1939, as they are being ushered off, the two main characters, one of the characters says, well, now they're saved from the blessings of civilization. This is showing we can still be masculine and cool and American without needing to do all the negative things that we were doing the whole time. And it's so cool that this is just completely ignored by the next big approach to Westerns, which is the cycles from Leone and Italian and stuff like that. It's very interesting to see that.
It's an interesting the end of this film, like the violence. I agree. I think that it's all very earned, and I think it paints it in an interesting way where again we have Rufus and the Major coming into this canyon from opposite sides. It's kind of like there's people everywhere, as we know, but everybody is kind of like, been told this is now kind of between the two of them. We watch them go into this valley, or kind of like this corner of this canyon. And they shoot, Wyler shoots this much like he shot the fight between James and Steve, where it's like this wide shot fight. We get the two of these guys kind of shooting at each other and dying at the bullets at the hand of the other in just this wide shot of looking down into the canyon of just these two men just laying there next to each other. And it paints this sense of just kind of like this brutal nature of the wilderness, and
Yeah.
that's what they were part of, and here we are going to move past that and into society, and
Yeah. It's
it's
also
a
just how
fascinating
small they
portrayal.
are.
Yeah,
Right? Like how small they are. Like, and that's what the fight between the two guys before. It's like,
exactly.
look at all this. You are two specks. Like,
Yeah,
get over yourselves. Which I think
exactly.
also says something. So maybe I'm going to come out. It sounds like I'm coming out against like Sergio Leone and things like that. But comparing that formally and stylistically to Sergio Leone, which is so many close-ups, so
Yeah.
many zooms
Yeah.
in on the faces, and showing how these things work in a lot of these times, it is kind of a difference between the way violence is used in these sort of texts, in a way that is useful, and a restraint is useful in this approach too. So yeah, I very much like it, and I think as someone, even though it is a little long for my students, I think it is one that is, I think, shows ways of, even in the 50s, us thinking about what does it mean to be a man in a way that is sustainable. Like, I usually, instead of like saying what is toxic or not masculinity, because that term has been poisoned a lot of times, I think about sustainable and unsustainable masculinity, right? Like sustainable masculinity or toxic masculinity is unsustainable masculinity, because if your idea of what is a man is that you are more powerful than everyone else, then there can only be one man eventually, and then that man will die, right? It's not sustainable. But if your idea of masculinity is, I have an idea of myself, other people have ideas of themselves, I'm going to hold true to it, then you can sustain that. Society can sustain that. And we kind of see this with the Big Country, where it's saying, like, he doesn't kill Stephen Leach. He doesn't kill anybody because he doesn't need to. He's like, I can be the master of my own domain, and you can be the masters of your own domain. You can both come to my well in the big money, and literally make that work.
Yeah, and hopefully in the process, Patricia learns something too. I mean, he's obviously going to be with Julie. We kind of knew that from the moment we saw Gene Simmons show up, but hopefully Patricia recognizes some of that in her life now. So
yeah, hopefully.
Yeah. All right, our final stop in this post-war Western landscape is Bud Bedeker's 1959 film Ride Lonesome. This lean, contemplative Western serves as a fitting epilogue to our exploration of the genre's evolution, as it strips the narrative down to its essential elements and reflects on the enduring themes of revenge, redemption, and the lonely pursuit of justice on the frontier. The story follows Ben Brigade, played by Randolph Scott, a taciturn bounty hunter who captures the notorious outlaw Billy John, played by James Best, and sets out to bring him to justice. Along the way, Brigade forms an uneasy alliance with two other gunmen, Sam and Whit, played by Pernell Roberts and James Coburn in his first film, while also contending with Billy John's vengeful brother, Frank, played by Lee Van Cleef. As the journey unfolds, Brigade's true motives and the weight of his past gradually come to light, leading to a stark and poignant reckoning. This film kind of distills the Western narrative right down to its essential elements. It's a very tight 73-minute film. What does this approach, this spare, very kind of existential approach, reveal about the genre and its enduring themes and the legacy, I suppose, of the American frontier?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So if you remember when I was talking about the super Westerns and Bazan saying he didn't really like the Westerns that couldn't just be Westerns, they've got to be something else. He loved Seven Men from Now, which is part of this whole cycle, the Renown cycle from Boddicker, because it was kind of a looking back at the B Western. What are the things that kind of fit for this? And what are the drawn out or specific tropes? And how does this work? This is kind of presenting a different way or a different approach to Westerns beyond the super Western or psychological Western approach, in a way that is kind of just, this is what it's like, and take it or leave it. There's a lot of sparse cinematography for this sort of thing. But I think that this shows, one, that idea of thinking of genres and an evolution or a progression line that's like, it begins here, where we are the Neanderthals of the early 1900s, and now in 2025 we are fully evolved humans, and there's one line. This shows that the B movie Western still was around and still existed. Like, this is also the same time like Gene Autry and Roy Rogers moved to TV at these sort of things, but like, this was also a strain that was going on, right? These were a little cheaper to make in these sort of approaches, but it also shows Boddiker's approach to this whole cycle. He uses Lone Pine, California, just like Ford uses Monument Valley, and he really approaches to its sparseness rather than its big colorfulness. This film, more than any of the other films on this list, reminds me of the movies that would come to dominate our understanding of what the Western is later on, the Sergio Leone Westerns, both because it's focus on bounty hunting, right? Lee Van Cleef is in it as well, so that's not going to put there.
Yeah.
But the sparseness of these places, I think, is and also the muted colors that I see in a lot of these feel much more attached to the sort of spaghetti westerns we'll see later, and the idea of masculinity here is very much not like a regression to the other forms of masculinity, but is very much like the silent masculine type that we get from here, like as opposed to the films that were beginning to question like what is whose power over language is what, like we saw in Johnny Guitar. Here we have Ben Brigade saying basically when the person asks like this, are you, you don't seem like someone who would like kill someone for money, he says, I am, like, yeah, I am killing him for money, knowing full well that he has other motives. He doesn't need to explain anymore. And then that moment between Van Cleef's Frank and Ben, where he says, like, do you remember that you killed my wife here, essentially? And he says, it was so many years ago, I near forgot, in a way that was kind of like sort of regretful in a wincing way. And Ben Brigade says, a man can do that, period. There's so much left unsaid there in this sparseness that shows some of the best of the sparse language that we see of the Western, and that was still around and surviving in a lot of these and the Westerns that weren't trying to be these psychological epics in the same way. And yet the thing that sticks with me among so many of the other films, the burning tree sticks in your head in a way that you can't really get out of your head, in a way that the best myths or pieces of folklore do too. So I feel like this does, and the whole Renown cycle to an extent. We talked about 7 Men from Now. I had pushed us to do Ride Lonesome. I watched both of them and liked them both, but I do think that Ride Lonesome has more interesting things to say about bounty hunting in general, and also the West in general. Andrew Sarris called this whole film a poker game, right? Of him like keeping things close to the chest and not really sharing things, and other people not sharing with the audience until close to the end, in a way that is different than the Big Country poker game, which kind of the secretiveness seems a little silly at some points. It's like, wait, really? But this is one that really fits within the code of what a Western ought to be and what a Western ought to do, at least what has come all the way to this point. Not to mention, Ben Brigade is just a great alliterative name that you'd love to have for something like this.
There's an element of the bounty hunter character here that I think I can see some of Shane in him, right? Where there's a world weariness, there's a moral toll that he's carrying on all of the stuff that he's been doing, that it kind of has tired him, and he just I mean, is he just taciturn, or is he just tired? And kind of, I mean, theoretically, he's been doing this, and now he's at this point where he's potentially capturing or killing the last person that he's after. It's, as we find out, it's not really Billy, but it's Frank that he's actually after. And in the process of actually finally killing Frank, is that the respite that he needed? Like, he's now able to kind of move past this. I mean, we know he gives the other guys the keys to Billy, so he's not going to actually go after the money. And that's an interesting element with this character, where he's just like, I can see him at the end of this, just like Shane, just kind of riding off again back into the wilderness and disappearing. And like, that's kind of the end of his way of life. And I think that in the scope of this decade, it's an interesting way to kind of close things out, where it's very kind of a quiet departure.
Yeah, I think if Shane is the spirit of the West, like this thing that is elemental and part of this that comes from the hills and goes back to the hills, he's very much a ghost of a cowboy, like Ben Brigade is, right? He is the well, I did my whole sheriff thing, because he was a sheriff, I think, in this one. I might be confusing it, but that's actually also part of the appeal of movies like this, where it's like they're not the same character, but they essentially are.
Similar,
And it becomes one of those things that can be serialized very interestingly. Not quite Man with No Name, but it definitely fits that approach. But he feels more like someone who has been a sheriff, did his thing, has had his happy ending disrupted by someone else, right? He killed these sort of things, and then becomes this revenant, which needs to enact justice before going. He is kind of, in some ways, the physical embodiment of that curse, that the gunfighter that we say at the end of the gunfighter. He comes and he does his thing, and he burns the effigy, which is the last. It's literally, it looks like an effigy of a woman too. It's very weird the way they shaped that tree or found it. Which is one of the reasons it sticks in your head so much. And now seeing that gone and kind of watching it burn, it's kind of unclear what his story is. But also it feels like he could just be a ghost that now is found rest or moved on his own thing. Or he could move on to the next adventure if we really wanted it to. But I think especially seeing the fact that the other bounty hunters we see in this, like compared to the bounty hunting in the later, like, Sergio Leone's spaghetti western movies, which is like, I'm run by greed, but I'm also run because I'm very cool, which seems to be the thing. There is this, he was a sheriff and then went into bounty hunting because he can make one more thing. It's not really about the bounty anymore, is it? Right? Just like for James Stewart character in Winchester 73, it's not really about the bounty, it's about the justice. Though he is very much a pulp character that could go on and on and on. And of course, in something like the end of Naked Spur, he's a very different sort of bounty hunter, so there's like a question there. Here he is just someone who's completing his mission, essentially, and his role in the story. And then we get Sam and Whit, who were originally going to die in the original script, right? They were originally going to try and betray the guy and get shot, at least as far as I was able to find. If someone else finds historically different, then call me a liar. But they apparently, Sam Boone wanted to do this bounty so he could get amnesty for the things he's done before, right? Really interesting, which is also very interesting in its own approach. And at the end, where like he says, he's asked the question, what are you going to do with the money? And he says, I'm just going to get a ranch. And I think, you know what, Whit, I'm going to hire you too. And Whit's like, why would you do that? And he's like, because I like you, Whit, you idiot. Right. Which is very much how the it's a kind of comedic version of how the language of men kind of approaches in these sort of things, where it's just like, oh, I never knew that. You never said it, which is the same thing that Marty says to Laurie way back in Searchers, where it's just like, what do you mean? I thought you kind of knew I liked you. But it's interesting. They're having a happy ending with the girl as well, which is like, all this is a different story. So Ben Brigade becomes this cowboy figure that's the end of his Western, right? And maybe there's another Western later on that becomes this interesting point. But for me, was a really good goodbye to this period.
And it speaks to the title, Ride Lonesome. And he's he's with all of these people, but he's best when he's out on his own. And at the end of the film, like, he starts the film on his own, coming and finding Billy, and here he leaves all of them behind and goes off on his own again. And that's kind of his place in this world. So
and that's kind of what the Western continues to do, right? Like, we especially now are getting more and more solitary little Westerns that come up and down. And some of the ones that really stick with us are the ones that are haunting for us. Many people have tried to bury the Western, but they haven't quite done it yet.
Will they ever be able to? We'll have to see. Well, let's actually take a quick break. And when we come back, let's chat a little bit more about the post-war Western's evolution and its impact. So, all right, we've kind of come to the end of the post-war Western, and which really, as we've discussed at length, really revolutionized the Western by challenging the traditional notions of heroism and villainy, masculinity, femininity. We're introducing more complex psychologically driven narratives. And to that end, I think it's important to just remind ourselves it's kind of shifted careers for people like John Wayne and Glenn Ford and Gregory Peck, introducing new talents like Montgomery Clift and and James Coburn,
Mm-hmm.
and redefining what the American West is. But from here, I mean, how does that impact where we go in the westerns? Because we've talked at length about, we go right into the spaghetti westerns in the '60s, along with revisionist westerns in the '60s and '70s, like the Wild Bunch, and you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Little Big Man, um, and then even into like the neo westerns in like the modern era with
Yeah.
things like Unforgiven and Dead Man and The Proposition. Uh, how do you see what happened here pushing into where it goes?
I think just like with Red River, we have this character Matt who kind of sees his father and does something different. We got a similar thing going on with the Western, right? When I talk to my students about what they think the Western is, the people who aren't just saying like, oh, Quentin Tarantino did Django Unchained and Hateful Eight, right? Those are Westerns. The people who have like further than that are thinking the spaghetti Westerns of Clint Eastwood sort of approach. And
Yeah.
maybe to an extent, like they think about the Wild Bunch, but it's definitely like the anti-Western or the over stylized Western that comes out of this. So anything before that becomes kind of like, oh, that's I guess the classic. That's pre-classic. That's like the pre thing of the genre. Whereas I think that's kind of what happened with these 50s westerns. They kind of have become read as more vanilla than things certainly like McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is doing something very wild. Like we talked about the prostitute archetype, right? It was just like we were always described as the lady of the night or something like that, or you know what I do and I won't explain it. But what Mrs. Miller does when she comes out, she says, "I'm a whore." Right. And this is what whores have to do. And I'm going to tell you your business. It was a very cool way. And the same way with like the violence of something like Wild Bunch or The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is definitely very different than the violence we would see. And even Shane, which was one of the first to have the like people on ropes that would be pulled back when they got shot, right? So it was making that violence more things. We begin to, at least my students and myself before I got all into this, forget that the 50s were more revisionist and questioning and weird. They become vanilla. Like, oh, I know what that is. That's the same white hat we've seen for the last 50 years, which isn't quite the same, right? So when we get things like the Wild Bunch or things that really become like anti-Westerns or very much pushing against it in a different way, I think that we've lost some of the weirdness of the 50s and some of the stylistic weirdness, the narrative weirdness, the ideological weirdness that came from this period that I don't know if the Hollywood genre system knew it was on the decline as it would be in the 60s, but it was starting, the signs were starting to show. Right. And we were starting to show these different approaches to television and other leisure time that really show a difference here. So I think that, like, if anything, what these did was people were looking at the television westerns, right, of the 50s, and kind of putting these together with those and saying like, they're the same thing, which kind of misses some of the things we've lost before. So what happens later on is the 50s become, yes, those are the classics. That's John Wayne era and no one else apparently, right? We think of Jimmy Stewart in Wonderful Life and nowhere else, right? It seems in a lot of these for people who aren't cinephiles. So I think that it becomes a place that has become more muted in its tone. It's like an old sepia photograph that just became one color, whereas in reality it was very different and very colorful and very weird what was happening outside of that frame. So I say that would be kind of what happened to the Western there, in that approach.
Yeah, and I think that kind of sums it up pretty well. And you know, there's a lot of other things that start happening that certainly will influence why these tones change, other wars, other conflicts around the world, other just changes in society that certainly cause those shifts. But I do think that I think that does give a kind of a good sense of it. And also I think it's important to just discuss briefly how it ended up influencing other genres, not just the Western genres. But I think, we've brought up the relationship that it has with film noir, but I think when you get into the neo-noir stories and you start looking at things like even Chinatown, you can start seeing some touches of the Western, kind of the moral complexities that we're discussing here.
Yeah, the
And
man with a gun, kind of searching for justice, that comes up again, again, again. What happens in the 80s, like into the 70s and 80s, after the new Hollywood has had their fun, the Hollywood Renaissance, and saying like, I'm going to skewer this sort of approach. We get a lot of things going underground. One film I show in my class is Near Dark, which is Catherine Bigelow, definitely a Western, right? But it's a vampire road Western. So it's very weird, this weird hybridization, which has been happening throughout, right? But now, since it's less cool to be a Western, we have to look for them elsewhere. And whether that's in Chinatown, or in war movies that we might see, or in just things that are neo-Westerns and are set up in a later time, but still very much feel like Westerns. Star Wars, right? Like the part where we come over the hill and see his parents' ranch or farm thing burning. That's literally almost shot for shot in some places out of The Searchers, right? It is pulling from, like, Han Solo is your gunslinger character. Indiana Jones is definitely an American, like watching Raiders of the Lost Ark and him jumping on a horse and then the music starts and he's following after that truck. Like, that's a train robbery. Once again, he does the same stunt that John Wayne does. Well, not John Wayne, but a character does in Stagecoach. One of the Native American stunt men go under the carriage. So they kind of
Canute, or the stunt man, the famous stunt.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for reminding me of his name. Thinking about the way that this all changes is the Western is in American cinema's DNA. And whenever someone makes a Western, they're saying something about America. So when we get into the 90s and we get this push about not only things like Dance with Wolves or Unforgiven, but like Melvin Peeble's Posse, which is a great approach to like thinking about race in the Western, or a couple of the other ones that have come up around those times. There is a looking at some of these things, and what they're looking at is the 50s versions. Not necessarily the Westerns of the anti-Westerns. They are revising what our heritage was, not revising the revisions in the same way.
Yeah. And I mean, even looking at things like that are much more modern stories, like No Country for Old Men or Wind River, that are both you know, crime dramas, crime thrillers, they're pulling a lot from the Westerns. And I think you see filmmakers like the Coen brothers who have their own Westerns. I think that you see that they tap into a lot specifically of this era, like the 50s, that they're looking at, because I think they enjoy the more rich storytelling that you can do as you are deconstructing this. And so I think it becomes, a fascinating lens at which to look at American history and identity and society in general.
Yeah. And I think that the Westerns, as I said, is hard to kill the Western. They're an undead genre in a different way than the franchise era seems to be undead. Like, we want corporations want an undying IP that we will never not see superheroes again. We will always come back to this, right? Or we're on Avatar 4 and 5, and Avatar does a lot of cool things, like that sort of approach. But the idea of the franchise era is the memories never have to die. But the thing with the Western, it was always starting from a place as, I know I'm going to die. It came out at a point that is past when the West was won or lost, or whatever you want to call it. And it is focusing on characters who know that in order for civilization to come in, there can be no more guns in the valley. There can be no more violent vigilantes like they are. They're going to have to go. And that's why when you get something like James Mangold's Logan from 2017, which is supposed to be a goodbye to this old grizzled character in this old grizzled genre, and then is resurrected later on for a very different franchise, right? We Can Feel the Way We Are About It. Very much feels like a Western, and is more put that fact because James Mangold also is the person who did 3:10 to Yuma in 2007, right? So it is definitely pulling on this culture of filmmaking that is being passed on from place to place, even if it has to pull like the X-Men approach, mutated to be looked at in a different way. So I think we see a lot of those today in the post-Westerns and the disguised Westerns of today. But a lot of the things they're pulling from are not the silent or singing cowboy Westerns of even earlier. They're pulling a lot from the 50s, where we were making up to 140 per year, and this was the golden age of the Western, right? So that's where I think they're pulling a lot of their stuff from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this has been a fantastic conversation, John. We've kind of covered the gamut of these post-war Westerns. So many great films, so many interesting points to discuss. Thank you so much for being here to be part of this conversation and bring so much information and detail to the table.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. Always love a chance to talk about Westerns.
That was great. Do you have anything you want to plug? Any socials where people can find you? Or I know you have a book coming out.
Yes, I do have a book coming out. It has nothing to do with Westerns. It's called Literary Game Adaptations. It will be out at the end of January, I suppose. It is, again, very different. So if you looked at it looking for Westerns, you won't find any there. But I'm currently working on some things that are looking at how games and new media have approached these classical Hollywood genres, especially including the Western, but also the heist film, the film noir, and thinking about how we can make these mechanical and what they say about American culture and America's future in a time that is very contentious for all of us, I'm sure. But yeah, that would be the only thing I'd plug, except for all these movies. You should go get a chance to watch them if you can. You'll find some for free up on Tubi and a couple on YouTube, unless they take that down. But
Right. Yeah, check them out. They're great films, everybody, and fantastic genre to study. So again, John, thank you so much.
Of course. Thanks so much.
Next month, we will be sticking with the 1950s as we blast off into the otherworldly realm of science fiction. We'll explore how this decade of cosmic curiosity and atomic anxiety gave birth to a galaxy of iconic creatures, daring space explorers, and mind-bending visions of the future. From the gleaming silver rockets to the pulsing theremin scores, we'll delve into the unique aesthetics and enduring themes that defined this golden age of cinematic speculation. Prepare to encounter the genre's most memorable menaces, from the brain-hungry Martians to the city-stomping behemoths, as we chart a course through the paranoid politics and existential fears that shaped these extraordinary films. So fasten your seatbelts, set your ray guns to stun, and get ready to boldly go where no podcast has gone before, as we embark on an unforgettable journey through the strange and wondrous world of 1950s sci-fi. Thanks for joining us on CinemaScope. Thanks for joining us. God, I've been talking. It's a long conversation. Thanks for joining us on CinemaScope, part of the True Story FM Entertainment Podcast Network. Music by Orcus and Aviad Zinamanas. Find us and the entire Next Reel family of film podcasts at truestory.fm. Follow at The Next Reel on social media, and if you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and review wherever you listen. And as we part ways, remember, your cinematic journey never ends. Stay curious. All right. How are you on time? Are we still good? Do you want to answer some questions?
Yeah, I can answer a couple questions. I have another meeting here at. I should be off by 3:15, but I got a little bit of time. So
all right, we'll go through a few of these comments. How do these movies handle Mexican and Hispanic characters? How would you compare their depictions to the depictions of Native Americans or African Americans?
See, that's a very good question. I think there are a couple of different films that are very interesting in their approach to Mexican characters. There was a weird thing going on in the 30s and into the 50s that kind of shows how race is very much a construct, where it was okay for a character to marry a Mexican person because they were Spanish and kind of European and not white. But it was certainly taboo for any person of African origin to marry or be with a white person at this time. Native Americans were also a weird place. I think if they were white enough, like we have the Indian princess trope sort of approach, was one of those things that was very problematic and continues on a lot of these things. Like even Broken Arrow, which is trying to do its best to show this, really falls into that trope in a way that's really upsetting, especially considering the history of violence of white men towards Native women. There are a couple films that handle Hispanic characters as more of a butt of a joke sort of thing, like Alfonso Cuarón's no, sorry,
Bedoya.
Bedoya. Yes,
Yeah.
I was thinking a different one, different person. His Ramon in Big Country is kind of the kind of silly character, a little bit of an oafish character, even though he's nice in this way. At least in a lot of American films, we don't see too much of that. But if you are interested in that, looking at the Furies is really fascinating, because one of the love interests, the person that the main character should be with, is Juan, and he and his family live on the ranch and had lived there forever, and is kind of being besieged by this guy. And he does this really great, like, noble sacrifice thing. And he is definitely the person that she is supposed to be with, I think, but then dies in the course of this film, and lets this really jerk kind of come in. But there's some really interesting points there, because the person who ends up killing the head rancher is his mother, who kind of shoots him and then like runs away cackling in this way. That's this really interesting, like, a return of the repressor, this return of like racist kind of approach and things, in a way that I think is really interesting. But a lot of the times in the 50s, very, very white characters in their own way. Though if I had to say it, I think there's a little bit more nuance to some of the Hispanic characters. Like we saw Helen.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
But I was like, that's interesting, because she's also like the prostitute, or so there's a line that they have there between, like, how are they writing that character?
Yeah, I'm thinking of things like back in 1939 Stagecoach. I know I keep going back to that, but it's one that really, really fits here well. We have Yakima, who is the main Hispanic character's wife, who is quote unquote a little bit savage, I think, and is like kind of this mixing, who ends up like being this great singer, and the actress is an awesome singer that has put these sort of things, but then becomes kind of a villainous character. So the villainous seductress trope we get that with Helen Ramirez in a particular way, but she is also very, very like full of herself, not full of herself, but she's very confident and poised. And she is like Vienna in that she used her implied prostitution to own this place and kind of bring it to what it is today. So she's like a pillar of the community in a way that I think is really interesting. I think there's a lot of more room for Hispanic characters in the Westerns that we see in this period than Native American characters, who are often cast in red face or trying to do the whole noble savage trope, versus where they were in the 20s, or black characters who are often not present at all.
No, or treated poorly, like in Cimarron, where it's which is I know a few decades earlier, but still, it's like it's doesn't paint a good picture. So
yeah, but if you want to look at that sort of thing, looking at Posse, Melvin Ben Peebles is a great way of approaching that. I'd show that instead of Unforgiven, because it is very much pulling from the traditions of blaxploitation cinema, which his father did, and it is pulling in a lot of music from the time, like a lot of music stars, and is very much, it includes Woody Strode, who's like the narrator, who like looks back at these things, is very aware of its relationship to the Western, and puts its own spin on it in a way that I think is unmatched in any other things, and it's much better than Django Unchained.
Yeah, interesting. I have to check that one out.
Mm-hmm.
How, if at all, does the idea of manifest destiny play into these films' narrative or themes of the frontier and settler expansion?
So going all the way back to the Turner discussion of like what makes an American American is them being someone who is forged by this, according to him, like empty land, and one that they have to fight with the forces of nature, which happen to include entire groups of people, the Native Americans. This is very much one where it's like, it is an understanding that eventually we will, like the white folks will own the whole continent, but there's going to be a place where, at least for him, the crisis of identity for Americans is what happens when you have no further frontier to go to. And for us, there's always a further frontier, whether that is, or at least that's the idea that is really inbred into the American spirit for him, and that there isn't a frontier, but that frontier is also accessible to us. So, the things we think about, like, oh, well, we don't have any more further to go in this industry, so let's go to this industry. Venture capital is literally that sort of thing. We're going to go and colonize the moon one day. It's like, why? Because we need another space, right? The final frontier is never the final frontier, but like that's wagon train in space as well. So I think aside from the Searchers, which is very much like, yeah, this is the way things approach, this comes in subtler ways. Like in Shane, the ranchers have this really interesting argument with Joe Starrett, who's like, this is a place for families, this is a place for farm. And he's like, and why is that? Because we killed the people here before, right? Like, so you owe us, right? Essentially, which is showing like, oh, when Turner was talking about we go through progressive stages of civilization for each, like as further we go west, that's also showing that like, yeah, Manifest Destiny involves first clearing the land, genocide, making it survivable, and then bringing in civilization bit by bit. So definitely that is acknowledged in a lot of these Westerns in a way that it's kind of like, we just need a space of exception where we can shoot people and be in danger and be okay, as it was in some of the B Westerns and the earlier Westerns we see.
Yeah. All right, gun to your head. What's your personal ranking of these Western director icons? Anthony Mann, John Ford, Howard Hawks, Delmer Daves.
Okay, gun to my head. That's a good one. I might draw first. I think I might have to put my personal rankings. The ones I like most, I think still Ford, Mann, Davies, Hawks. I'm not the biggest fan of Hawks as far as the Westerns go for him. Okay. I don't dislike it, but like, you know, Rio Bravo was done to like say like, hey, I don't want this, the person being afraid of these things. I want a guy who rejects everyone's help and still does it anyway, but he also has help. It's kind of that's a little bit of the machismo that I'm not as a big fan of. But then again, I'm talking about John Ford, Anthony Mann, and Delmer Davies too. But I really like I like Ford Stagecoach very much, and like the way that he approaches things. Anthony Mann's writing is probably what puts me up there, and like the connections between these things. I really like the Furies, as I said. Naked Spur is great. Winchester 73 is great. And I really, really love 310 to Yuma. So I probably put Davies and Mann close together there.
It makes it tough, right?
Yeah.
Some colorful Technicolor 50s Westerns, some Oklahoma, some musical versions. Seven Brides for Seven Brothers and Oklahoma were mentioned as some ones that we didn't bring up. Would you say these movies generally treat characters' obsession more as a positive or a negative, and why?
I think when it's framed as obsession, it's negative, but when it's framed as duty, it's not, right? Like, I think definitely the Searchers framed as an obsession, right?
Absolutely. Negative obsession. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think with High Noon, he's stubborn, but he feels it's his duty, right? Same with Delmer, I almost said Delmer, Dan Evans, is an approach to that.
What about Lynn? Where does Lynn fit? Because
I kind of feel Lynn's more justice in his own way. I mean, like it is his brother. If he let that go, he couldn't do it, right? So I think that is more framed as determination rather than obsession, but that's kind of how it works always.
Yeah, that's a tricky one for sure. This one's interesting. Red River. Any thoughts on how the film treats property rights and ownership? For example, taking other settlers' cattle during the drive, branding, Don Diego's goons, etc.
etc. I think that it is the might makes right approach, right? Where, as I said, like this is very much somebody coming in, and instead of saying like, oh, this is virgin land, nothing's been touched, we do have one character says, no one's using this land, we should use it, right? That was Brute. And then we have, instead of saying, can I purchase it from Don Diego? Can I do these things? He's like, the reason I get it is because I am cool and I can kill you. So it's like a might makes right approach, which one of the reasons I'm, I guess, a little more cautious of Hawks. I'm not entirely sure Hawks is against, at least in the Force of Wayne in these ways. It becomes like, yeah, he's an Ahab character, but if you are powerful enough, maybe that's how you do it. A lot of the things in that film has to do with power. When it treats property rights and ownership, it's kind of like the might makes right. And maybe that is read as that's just the way the West is. But that's actually one of the reasons why I've approached like Sergio Leone's with a little bit more skepticism. I had a student who said he prefers things like Good, the Bad, and the Ugly because it's just more realistic. And I say, what do you mean by realistic? There's literally a guy who fires a cannon like Looney Tunes style and shoots a guy off a horse, right? Like that's a very different thing. But he says more realistic because it's how people would act if they were put like in these situations. And I said, I don't know about you, but if someone put $1,000 in the middle of this room and both gave us guns, I'd let you have the money, right? And like that is a very different approach to what realism is in that approach. That I think that like I guess feels different in Red River or that approach though. I think like just maybe what means realism? What does realism even mean is a question that's one of my own personal bugbears.
Well, yeah, and I think you're always going to be contending with that in some capacity when you enter the world of film, because in some ways, no matter how true the story is and real, it's always a fiction, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what counts as real?
Yeah, right. This is from Brian. I have an impression, which may be my movie bubble, that these days George Stevens is kind of the least cool, least fashionable of the World War II era Golden Age Hollywood director icons. Thoughts?
I think that's interesting. As someone who is, again, didn't grow up as a movie buff, love George Stevens' Shane, and know George Stevens from like Shane is part of the American trilogy, as a lot of people put it, is like just three things that are not Westerns, but are talking about America. Yeah. I don't think people would recognize him as a Western director or any director was just talking on the street. So I think like maybe least cool. Sure, if we're talking about Shane as a representative of his work, certainly least cool because he's not because it's Shane and that's like most white hat as anyone else, as people say. But I don't know if it's less name recognition than the others, certainly, that we remember from this year's. But then again, there are many that we don't remember either that were important at the time.
I mean, yeah, I feel like a lot of people. I never heard people talking about Bud Bedecker until the Criterion released a renowned film series, and now I feel like he's talked about quite a bit. And so it's interesting, like how something like that can completely shift the conversation. So,
yeah, it just depends on what people are looking at. Academics go through trends just like everyone else does, right? Sure. Like like the reason why Citizen Kane was so good for a while and then it moved to Vertigo is because a lot of people were like, I like that psychological weird sort of thing that maybe feminist approach that's going on in Vertigo too. And I like that more than Citizen Kane, which was like the classical choice. So, academics in different circles will have different ideas. I've said the same thing when we were trying to figure out which of the like renowned cycle to look at. I was like, I hadn't really heard too much in the critical scholarship of any of them except for maybe this one. And since then, I've looked in more and seen more approaching. But again, it goes in cycles.
Totally. Absolutely. Let's end here with this question. When teaching these movies, how do you convey to students what movie star personas were? Which of these stars are typically favorites for students?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things I try to tell my students in my intro to film classes usually are that in the franchise era is characters over stars is one of the things that kind of present this. And they say like, no, I love Timothée Chalamet. It's like, well, it doesn't work the same way, right? Like you're not a John Wayne. You're not even a Will Smith in the 90s, right? Like this is a different sort of approach to this. So students haven't always got who these things are, except for like John Wayne, who's like, oh yeah, I get he's playing a similar guy in a lot of these things, and he is a larger than life actor. But we only really watch, because I try and make things diverse too in my things. We only really watch Stagecoach and Searchers with him in it, at least in the version of the classes that exists now. Yeah. So a lot of them don't get too stuck up on that, except for when we're talking about Johnny Guitar and I talk about Joan Crawford. They still don't get it because we don't have enough like Joan Crawford movies in there. But I'm able to explain what star persona kind of works like here. That and a mix of in Treasure of the Sierra Madre, Humphrey Bogart and Tim Holt saying like, here's a clip from one of Humphrey Bogart's early roles where he was playing just a gangster. And then here's one from Tim Holt's early roles where he's like talking to people at a campfire. And so they kind of get that idea, but at least for this class, that seems like another thing that people haven't really approached too much. If I had to say actors they like, Generally, Joan Crawford is the one that they very much like. People are not very much a big fan of John Wayne. People like Joan Crawford just because of the one that we see her in.
Yeah.
But
right.
people like Clint Eastwood when he comes up. But I think a lot of them are just knowing them from the couple films we're watching in class. Again, a lot of students that I'm finding are not watching these Westerns. The people who have very few ideas of who they are. Aside from that, I think there's one other guy, John Carradine, who plays the bad guy in the kind of the gambler in Stagecoach. He also comes up as Tom in Johnny Guitar, and he appears in I show a poster from I think it's Bronco Billy versus Dracula, and he's Dracula in that. So it's like he comes up every so often, and they like find John Carradine. But that's except for him and Buck from not Buck. Oh, now I'm forgetting his name. I think those are really the ones that people would recognize.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, I mean, fantastic conversation again. Thank you so much, and thanks for sticking around for an extra long conversation. I certainly appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone, for your questions.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to end the stream. Hang tight if you could.